13 years ago, Telltale released the first episode of The Walking Dead, a game which would not only change their fate as a company, but would change the landscape of the gaming industry for good. Lead writers Sean Bannerman and Jake Rodkin would go on to found Campo Santo and create another masterpiece, Firewatch. A little-known group of French game developers would be inspired by the Telltale model to create Life is Strange, now a phenomenon expanding the life and the possibilities of the narrative episodic game genre. And zombie games, a genre rarely considered to be artistic, thought-provoking, or anything other than a cesspool of mindless violence, would have a question posed right to its unbeating heart, or should I say, decomposing brain. What if zombie games could say more? Perhaps ironically, Telltale as a company would be consumed into bankruptcy by the self-consuming, flesh-eating forces of capitalism. The unexpected critical and commercial success of The Walking Dead led to a bloating of Telltale's creative portfolio, where, following Robert Kirkman, creator of the Walking Dead franchise and the company Skybound Entertainment, Telltale was tasked with creating narrative episodic adventures for a series of intellectual properties, from Game of Thrones, to Batman, to Borderlands, to The Wolf Among Us. And I mean, they were making all of these games at the same time and on compressed episodic release schedules. The company also struggled with the rapid technological advancements of the 2010s, which their aged game development engine, the Telltale tool, struggled to keep up with. All of this led to a need for more staff, all of whom worked under increasingly unsustainable pressure. This resulted in communication fault lines, crushing workloads, impossible deadlines, and a sometimes patchy quality of work, lamented by developers themselves, explaining the pressure that they were under and the stifling of their creative vision by higher-ups. Not unrelated to these material conditions of the series' development, which began in 2012 and ended with workers on The Walking Dead's final season receiving news halfway through the development process about the bankruptcy of the studio and the loss of their jobs, swiftly if temporarily saved by the intervention of Skybound Entertainment. In this video, I want to talk about what I think is an under-discussed aspect of Telltale's The Walking Dead and its very important legacy. Especially since the 10-year anniversary of The Walking Dead's release, there have been retrospectives abound, but few of them have addressed that, to this day, popular games with black, racialized, and child protagonists and avatars, which take such thoughtful, intentional approaches to the role of race and age in storytelling, are still really rare. Now, place these 4 Walking Dead games, each a chapter of a larger story, within the context of a zombie apocalypse that questions the capitalist world order, the very world order in which its creators were making these games, and we've got an absolute mine for the analysis of race, class, childhood, and more. Place all of that within the dominant trends of zombie games, and you've got something that can really help us interrogate what zombie games are really saying, and why we should be concerned about it. With a focus on a close reading of the text, this is the definitive deep dive into Telltale's The Walking Dead. I should fucking hope so anyway, because I think this is the longest video I've made yet. Hello, and welcome or welcome back to Game Assist. I'm Sara, pronouns they, them, and she, her. Insert content creator spiel here. Remember to please subscribe and turn on the notification bell if you're interested in more content like this, and if you really like what we do, consider joining our Patreon community from just £1 a month, or buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. All of our links are in the description. Now, this video will contain spoilers for all seasons of Telltale's The Walking Dead. Slight spoilers for The Walking Dead comics and TV shows, and slight spoilers for other zombie games like Dead Rising 1 and 2, Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare, and more. Before we get stuck in, here are some content warnings, because there's some heavy stuff in these games. In this video, there will be depictions and discussions of flesh-eating zombie-related blood and gore, emergency non-anaesthetised medical procedures in non-sterile environments, killing, gun violence, knife violence, suicide, child abuse, racism, eugenics, and family separations. In games, zombies are often just empty bodies for target practice. Empty bodies for pleasurable, guilt-free killing. The apparent brainlessness of zombies is part of what makes them so easy to kill. They're just bare life, as Giorgio Agamben puts it. Zombies are like animals, not real, valuable life worthy of material rights and freedoms, but worthless, disposable bodies. Well, if their unlives are worth anything, it's what we can use them for. Maybe watchdogs, maybe scarecrows, maybe fun and games. To use an anthropocentric term, which is a fancy word just meaning the assumption that humans are better than other life forms and everything revolves around humans, then the zombie, especially in games, is the quintessential dehumanized enemy. Zombies are most threatening not as individuals, but as collectives. Players might take some pleasure in stabbing one zombie in the head, but even more in committing mass violence against zombie hordes with tanks, planes, bombs, you name it. I mean, they don't think, feel, or speak, right? So what's the harm? If you've watched our video on ye olde military shooter, titled The War Economy as a nod to Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid, of course, what I'm saying might sound familiar. And yeah, the majority of zombie games are pretty much interchangeable with military shooters. They have a lot of the same underlying logics. For example, DayZ, the Battle Royale-style online survival horror game, began its unlife as a mod for the military shooter Arma 2. Of course, there's Call of Duty Zombie Mode, also designed for online cooperative play. And before you fire off that keyboard and drop anything in that comment box, yes, I know that the Nazi zombies thing is a whole other conversation, but I'm putting a pin in it for today. World War Z Aftermath, yet another zombie game designed for cooperative and/or online play, built off one of the most profoundly racist novels I've ever read in my life. Like, this is literally American imperialism alternate universe fanfiction, configuring the zombie apocalypse as a war against zombies, led by our old settler colonial imperialist heroes, Israel and the United States. Crucially, what we're concerned about is how these gameplay similarities, what you do in these games and why you're doing it, means something ideologically. A lot of these games construct zombies as guilt-free enemies for pleasurable mass killing, in super similar ways to military shooters, which construct racialized people as, well, guilt-free enemies for pleasurable mass killing. Notice how you almost never play as a zombie? We've got shitloads of games where we play as vampires and werewolves, but not zombies. On the rare occasion you can play a zombie, it's usually functionally a cosmetic skin, like in Red Dead Redemption, Undead Nightmare, or in Mortal Kombat. Or it's a shorthand for switching up the co-op team you're on, like in Left 4 Dead. Little is done to explore the zombie's embodied experience in the game world. Zombie John Marston, for example, has his voice lines replaced with zombie grunts to a slightly comic effect.
Family wanted you to have this.
But he simply isn't like other zombies, who will attack him like he's a human being, and whom he will continue to gun down without feeling a thing. And that's sort of a shame, because Red Dead Redemption Zombie DLC Undead Nightmare actually does some pretty interesting, if ultimately contradictory and unsatisfactory stuff with what zombies represent. Some characters explicitly blame the zombie plague on racialized groups, Mexicans, immigrants, Jewish people, but those who sympathize with zombies are also ridiculed or belittled. Either people shoot zombies, exploitatively treat them like entertainment, or genuinely care for them. John Marston, of course, is the rational centrist, who recognizes the need to kill zombies without being subject to the foolish racial hysteria of others. Undead Nightmare's grand twist is that the American president caused the zombie plague by stealing an indigenous artifact for the sake of greed and power, so John must return the artifact to restore the natural order. Nevertheless, a double standard persists. John will not kill his own zombified wife and child, and his mission is to find a cure for them, but he's totally happy to wipe out all other populations of undead. At the end of the DLC, when his wife and child revert to humans, we wonder why we couldn't have at least tried a non-violent approach to some other zombies all along. In the end, the point is not to ask questions, but to run around having fun shooting zombies like a badass lonesome cowboy, while feeling self-assured that you're smarter than everyone else and are definitely not racist. When it comes to the interchangeability of military shooters and zombie games, a quick look at the World War Z video game Aftermath reveals their racial logics. The premise of the novel, which the game is based on, is that a zombie outbreak quickly turns into a global war on zombies, so of course zombies are immediately constructed as an enemy to eradicate completely, rather than, infected people to care for. The novel even emphasizes that those who don't agree with this view of zombies are stupid, even mad, to the point of acting like zombies themselves, which dooms them to the zombified populations to be shot at and eradicated by military personnel. World War Z, unsurprisingly, has some of the most overt Zionist propaganda I've ever read, as does the game. In Aftermath's Jerusalem levels, you can play as a former member of the British Special Air Service, or SAS, recruited by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, a girl-boss Israeli occupation forces soldier with a marked American accent and, no doubt, thriving TikTok presence, another IOF soldier who can't pronounce hummus but claims it as Israeli food, and an American photojournalist. Aligned with the Western Imperial Corps and its military and intelligence institutions, you run around the virtual space of Jerusalem, shooting comically fast herds of zombies whose individual bodies form singular pulsating masses, sort of like a Resident Evil boss, if it metaphorically represented oppressed people and you were actually the baddie. The institutions, structures, and architecture of Israeli settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid, so the IOF, Mossad, the apartheid wall, and the checkpoint system, are all legitimized by the presence of the zombie hordes. These structures, which in real life and in the continuity of the World War Z universe are built, we are told, in response to the perceived racial threat of Palestinians, really for the purpose of eradicating indigenous people and conquering their land, are justified. Because, what better way to fight off a zombie apocalypse than with walls, checkpoints, and the largest, most well-funded military in the world? The threat of Palestinians and the threat of zombies are rhetorically interchangeable, and Israel's need to defend itself from such racial threats, which will invade and destroy the state and spread contagion in their hordes, is reaffirmed. Thank God for girl boss Kamala Harris and her checks to Israel. How else will we survive if we don't eradicate those scary, repulsive Palestinians? I mean, zombie hordes. World War Z is just one example, but the zombie mass always seems to resemble in some way the disabled, racialized working class. The zombie's body is wrong in all the right ways. More specifically, we should think of the zombie not necessarily as representing these groups as they actually are, but as they are perceived under global racial capitalism. To start with the racialization of the zombie, as I touched on in World War Z, zombies are undifferentiated. They have no individuality. They are pests and parasites who leech off our resources, who threaten to invade our shores and infect our way of life. They come in swarms and hordes. They're evil and threaten our freedom, and any sort of negotiation is impossible because of their fundamental barbarism. This is all rhetoric which invokes racial tropes about migrants, as John Stratton writes in Trouble with Zombies, and tropes about Muslims, as Eric Hamako writes in Zombie Orientals Ate My Brain. John Stratton writes specifically about zombies as bare life, meaning life which exists outside of the safety, privilege, and comfort of recognition by the state. So, undocumented, propertyless, houseless individuals who can be considered socially dead in the sense that no record of them exists, and this hinders their ability to access employment, housing, and other basic necessities. Zombies, of course, are neither alive or dead, just like the socially dead are, those people who are reduced to bare life. This rhetoric of zombification, of course, has a class dimension too. The poor are parasites, benefit scroungers, that leech off hardworking people. Oh, and triple whammy, that applies to disabled people too, if they can't work. Speaking of disability, Barbara Ann Jackson writes in Zombification of Disability that the zombie's body can be read as disabled in various ways. It reflects a fear of infection, or the spreading of disability. Their so-called disfigurement resembles people with facial differences. The zombie usually, but not always, has a slow, stuttering walk and a lack of coordination, like those with cerebral palsy, dyspraxia, or other disabilities. Their dissociative state invokes complex trauma and mental distress, dissociation as a response to trauma or as a result of being drugged out on psychiatric medication or other drugs. They smell bad, like those houseless or struggling with hygiene. They are nonverbal, noise-sensitive, and single-mindedly focused on their goal, like some autistic people. Their noise sensitivity seems to be linked to limited vision. They are alive but dead in the way that people are described when brain activity has stopped. They're asexual, which isn't necessarily true of all disabled people, but is certainly a trope about disabled people. And people aren't just afraid of being hurt by zombies, but afraid of becoming zombies, which can be read as a fear of social death. Being afraid of the precarity of capitalism, of houselessness or deportation, or having one's citizenship revoked, the fear of losing oneself to the soulless grind of capitalism, or the fear of becoming disabled, as we all will if we aren't already, or if we don't die first. This zombification of the disabled links us to disturbing histories of euthanasia. We often take it for granted that one is better off dead than a zombie, in the same way we might think someone is better off dead than disabled. It's precisely this attitude to justification and normalization of euthanasia, which was used in Nazi Germany in the early 20th century as the first step towards the institutionalized mass killing of disabled people. Today, disabled people are still being systematically bound and killed through the use of do not resuscitate orders and euthanasia, afforded only the right to die, never the right to live. The disabled-led organization Not Dead Yet is a great resource to learn more about that. Interestingly, Anna Mae Dwayne also writes that some disabled people have actually begun to claim the label zombie proudly. The Disabled Children's School Arch Academy has a swimming team named the Arch Academy Zombies. Nick Santanastasso, a one-limbed Walking Dead fan, gained internet fame for using his zombie-like body to prank unsuspecting non-disabled folks on the streets of New Jersey. And Ellen Samuels, a disability scholar, famous for her theorization of crip time as moving at the pace one can, in the face of the relentless capitalist drive to rush towards production, says, "I do often feel like a zombie, with no hint of disgust." These racialized, disabled, working-class monsters are not seen as having any individuality. They are often seen as a threat, not always individually, but as a collective with the combined strength to revolt, invoking the fear of revolution from the oppressed masses. And that isn't just me reading zombies as a metaphor, it's actually connected to the history of where our modern idea of a zombie comes from. The first records of the word zombie in the US settler colony came from American anthropologists writing about the voodoo religion of the Haitian people, a religion developed from the traditions of enslaved Africans and traceable to their religions of origin from homelands like the Congo region. Elizabeth McAllister writes in The Race and Religion of Zombies that in Haitian religious thought, part of the spirit goes immediately to God after death, while another part lingers near the grave, and this part can be captured by a sorcerer. Until it's time for the spirit fragment to go to God, it can be stored in an object, like a bottle, and used for healing, protection, or aggression. The zombie can rebel. For example, if its owner doesn't give it anything in return for its work, the zombie might attack them, eating their life force and becoming more powerful as it does. There is this spirit zombie, a fragment trapped in an object and forced to work by the sorcerer, and there is a corpse zombie, which is closer to our current westernized view of zombies. The sorcerer extracts the spirit from the body before death, and the body is sold to cut cane sugar on a plantation. This is the body without a soul, the body as nothing but body, the body as dehumanized worker, dehumanized slave. Between 1915 and 1934, the US settler colony sent Marines to establish political and financial control of Haiti, ostensibly to bring freedom, democracy, and stability to the country, really to establish neocolonial control over it after the success of the Haitian Revolution and the establishment of a Haitian Republic outside of colonial control. During this period, American anthropologists traveled to the Haitian Republic and became fascinated with the zombie, writing accounts charged with racial fear, derision, and condescension towards so-called superstitious and uncivilized Haitians who had returned to primitivism in the absence of benevolent white colonial rule. Elizabeth McAllister argues that the horror of the zombie for white Americans was the image of the disfigured body dispossessed of its soul, will, agency, and hence its interiority and its very humanity. In other words, white people were afraid of being subjected to exactly what they had subjected enslaved people to. This is starkly represented in the first zombie movie, White Zombie, directed by Victor Halperin and released in 1932, where zombified Haitians working the sugar mills is a matter of course, while the zombification of a white woman is an affront to civilization and must be reversed. The terrifying practice of zombification and the image of the zombified Haitian were images deployed to justify American military intervention in post-revolution Haiti during this period. From the 1960s onward, a distinct Western zombie tradition began to emerge. The flesh-eating ghouls of George Romero's 1968 sleeper hit, Night of the Living Dead, were amalgamated with the word zombie to create a new American creature. This new zombie had no master, instead rising from the dead mysteriously, sometimes due to supernatural causes like in Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare, but more often due to scientific ones like radiation or contagion, like in World War Z. While it remained soulless, it was now mysteriously driven to eat flesh. Of course, the image of the cannibal is also a familiar racial trope which characterizes barbaric Africans as flesh-eating monsters in order to justify white colonial intervention. Nowadays, the zombie is not always commodified or exploited as a slave, the way the Haitian zombie is, but is now an endless consumer. However, in spite of this distinctly American takeover of the zombie image, the fear of Africans and Haitians, the fear of being enslaved, and the fear of slave revolt, particularly the successful Haitian Revolution, are still held in the zombie's decaying body. While associations with blackness and voodoo persist today, the zombie after 1968 became widely detached from its tradition, becoming white, raceless, or racially diverse masses of cannibalistic monsters, spreading contagion, invading the American home, and all that jazz. But the modern zombie still, like the Haitian zombie, always seems to have something to do with colonialism and capitalism. They are conveniently deployed as a metaphor for American consumerism, a catalyst for survivor characters' petty individualism, selfishness, and racist bloodlust. As Justin Vaccaro puts it, if the zombie did not exist, the West would have invented it. And perhaps it did just that in Haiti, through the institutions of colonialism, capitalism, and especially slavery, and the creation of the socially dead, where the slave is desocialized and depersonalized, made into a non-being, the living dead. The zombie is a wholly modern phenomenon. Nowadays, the zombie is almost always associated with the apocalypse, the near or complete collapse of American society. We can read zombie apocalypses specifically as the revolt of the enslaved and exploited masses, destroying the old world to bring about a necessary transformation. The zombie is everywhere in modern culture. We often find ourselves calling each other zombies when in some kind of dissociative state. We're zombies who watch too much TV, we play too much video games, we're zombies who won't get off their phones, we're drugged up zombies, making the question of who we zombify and how we zombify each other pertinent to understanding systemic violence and dehumanization in our society. In my video on Vampire, I defined Foucault's concept of biopower at length, but in short, under late-stage capitalism, biopower requires the human body to be perceived as a machine used for work, which will generate profit. According to Justin Vaccaro, biopower manages and conducts life itself, and does this by reducing human subjects to nothing but biological material, automata, zombies. In other words, zombies may represent how workers are alienated from their humanity by their oppressors or within themselves. They may represent how, as workers, we enter into dissociative states to produce, or how we even become physically disabled by work. Think about the maiming of miners or factory workers, or the development of fatigue, back pain, or other physical ailments from various forms of constant work. Think about how we might rely on substances to make it through the week. Vaccaro says, humans are reduced to bare biological life that can be operated on, controlled, and exploited. In the age of biopower, all have the potential to become zombies. But not all zombies are made equal. A haunting, vital essay by Travis Linneman, Tyler Wall, and Edward Green, titled Zombification and the Normalization of Police Violence, argues urgently that we must recognize reports of zombies and cannibals not only as salacious, thoughtless reporting, but also as part of a larger ideological frame that normalizes state violence and concedes the fundamental inequalities of late capitalism. Okay, but what the hell does that mean? The process of zombification that Linneman, Wall, and Green are talking about is the process of marking someone for exclusion by the state, therefore marking them for death, leaving them in a state between life and death like a zombie. This is basically what I was talking about earlier. Reducing someone to bare life or marking them as socially dead are helpfully summarized through the concept of zombification. Zombies deserve houselessness, statelessness, starvation, to be shot squarely in the head without remorse. To zombify someone is to spin that narrative about them, basically. When someone is zombified, the narrative that zombifies them constructs state, in this case police, violence as legitimate and necessary in response to the supposedly immediate danger from this evil, monstrous person, this zombie, to protect the living, those who are included and protected by the state. So when the police shoot an unarmed black man, they don't shoot a living person but a zombie, a monstrous, violent, drugged-up creature. Killing a zombie isn't like killing a person, because they're already dead. To really drive the material implications of all of this home, what's particularly chilling is that private security firms and police officers are literally organizing events and writing handbooks centered around the imagined scenario of a zombie apocalypse in order to train them for their jobs today. I mean, they are literally being encouraged to see criminalized people as zombies, as dead, inhuman monsters that they don't need to feel guilty about shooting in the head. As Linneman, Wall, and Green put it, zombification works to normalize state violence and a sort of guilt-free killability. And if we link this to the interchangeability of zombie games and military shooters, which are increasingly being used to recruit and train soldiers during an ongoing genocide by the organization that trains the American police, that is, the Israeli occupation forces, then your harmless zombie killing in video games is actually materially linked to the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people halfway across the world. Just fucking let that sink in. Right, so if zombies can represent all that, then what about the living? A common theme in a lot of zombie media is the position of government and state institutions and how they respond to the zombie crisis. Whether they survive and adapt, seen in the zombie entertainment shows and endless brutal military containments of Dead Rising, for example, or they successfully overcome the crisis, proving their heroism and goodness, like in World War Z, or they collapse under the weight of their incompetence or heightened repression, seen, of course, in The Walking Dead. This raises questions around one of the fundamental contradictions in modern American capitalism, epitomized in a fun little ideology called libertarianism. That contradiction is that we hate the government telling us what to do, but we want the government to tell other people what to do. Libertarianism is, on its surface, a political philosophy advocating for minimal state intervention in the free market and the private lives of citizens. Remember what I said about bare life earlier, and how citizens is a certain group of privileged people? Libertarians are skeptical of state intervention, believing the state is inefficient and wastes people's hard-earned cash on social welfare for useless, lazy bums who leech on that welfare. If we let corporations do whatever they want to do, decreasing taxes, encouraging privatization, and reducing government oversight, that's good for the little guy. How could that possibly be good for the little guy, you ask? Well, because with free markets, the little guy clings to the dream of becoming the big guy himself, if he just works hard enough. Meaning, the individual freedom that the libertarian believes in is economic freedom for corporations, underpinned by racist, disableist, and classist logic. So, a libertarian fundamentally is a kind of capitalist individualist. As Rich Templin and Jennifer Prophet put it, the individual is the center of the universe and the collective good is met not by any form of central government, but by the actions of individuals in furtherance of their own self-interests. The government can't be trusted because any sort of centralized support helping other people must be against my self-interest. That is to say, I assume that whatever is given to others is being taken away from me. On a social level, libertarians advocate for personal freedoms to say and do whatever we want, unrestricted by pesky things like protections for workers or marginalized groups. In short, I'll call someone a slur if I damn well please because that's my freedom of speech, and I'll shoot that in the head too if they set foot on my property. These beliefs lead to an awful lot of contradictions and have very worrying material consequences. For example, libertarians might be highly critical of the government, but they support highly authoritarian state policies, which, of course, require state interventions. Part of this is due to a conflation between private property and personal property, meaning a libertarian might tell me that because I'm a dirty commie bitch, I want to take your house away, because communists don't believe in private property. But your house isn't private property, it's personal property. And my dirty commie ass actually thinks that everyone should get one of those, even this asshole who's calling me a dirty commie bitch. Private property is what's owned by private corporations, rather than the state, which is public property, or by collectives or commons. Of course, private property is sort of what capitalism is all about. So, libertarianism might seem contradictory to authoritarianism, but in practice, as a series of state practices, it manifests in huge support for authoritarianism. Because of the conflation between the personal and the private, and the stubborn hope that little guys can become big guys if they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, libertarianism's belief in the inalienable right to private property, which should be defended at any cost, has the material result of strengthening the government's political, financial, and military support of private corporations, strengthening militarization within society, and perpetuating authoritarian control of opposition to private bodies and the institutions that support them. Hence the contradiction at the undead heart of libertarianism. For you to do whatever you want, no one else can do whatever they want, which means that your individual freedom must be infringing on someone else's individual freedom. So if everybody is free in this way, then no one is free. Sort of looking like having radical individual freedom under free capitalist markets is actually a bit of a logical fallacy, huh? Rich Templin and Jennifer Prophet write of libertarianism in the zombie apocalypse genre. The greatest threat is not the flesh-eating living dead, but both other survivors no longer constrained by any institutions of liberal democracy, and the lack of essential services provided by the same. Working towards the collective good is overshadowed by the need to defend and maintain self-interests, suggesting that collectivism is necessary to survive the apocalypse. The state institutions that people took for granted, healthcare, public transportation, sanitation, communications, and so on, are all gone, and it turns out we miss them. There's something here about how the loss of undervalued, invisibilized labor in our society becomes starkly felt in these zombie apocalypse scenarios, though sadly this doesn't lead a lot of us who watch zombie media to be radicalized to support, say, cleaners, bus drivers, or receptionists in labor disputes. Now, with the collapse of these institutions, everyone's looking out for themselves, under the assumption that everybody else's self-interest conflicts with their own self-interest, so we all kill each other and steal from each other until nobody's left. Humans are almost always a bigger threat to the protagonists than the zombies, because zombies won't steal your food or your house. This capitalist libertarian individualism is naturalized, meaning it's made to appear natural. We hear it's our human nature. We get these misanthropic cycles of violence narratives about how all this violence is inevitable because humans are all fundamentally bad and selfish. Capitalist individualism is naturalized as the human survival instinct, which leads us into a eugenicist pit called social Darwinism, the idea that some humans are just better than others, more fit to survive, and therefore more deserving. The zombie apocalypse genre is full of people talking about who is or isn't strong enough to survive. The Last of Us is a particularly misanthropic, nihilistic, severely racist example, but I bitch about that in another video if you want that drama. Social Darwinism has provided a pseudoscientific justification for systematic racism, disableism, imperialism, and eugenics over the last century and a half. But also, it's just incorrect. Historically, human survival has always been contingent on the forming of collectives that started off by hunting together and protecting each other, because on our own, humans are really not very strong, fast, or impressive animals. We're inherently social creatures and rely upon each other for survival. It's capitalism that has infected us with this individualist libertarian ideology, and so the misanthropy and the selfish, destructive behavior at the heart of many zombie stories needs to be viewed as politically specific, not at all universal or natural. In these new worlds, the institutions of capitalism have collapsed, but our minds remain colonized by them. We carry capitalism's ideology and its legacy with us, and this is what leads so many communities to fail. Look, I know this might sound kind of crazy, but our collective interest usually lines up with our individual interest, even if it doesn't look that way at first. Like, universal healthcare, housing, or basic income doesn't take anything away from you. It makes sure your basic needs are secured, while without them you could become unhoused or you could starve at the drop of one too many medical bills. But another important aspect of this is how capitalism manufactures our reliance on its institutions. We're alienated from the means of production of our basic necessities, food, water, sanitation, housing, and without the state structures that we depend on, in zombie apocalypse scenarios we find ourselves without the necessary skills. People find themselves scavenging for finite canned food, because under capitalism the vast majority of us don't know a thing about growing our own food. We always buy it at the supermarket and never think about how it got there. Clean water comes out of our taps at a whim. We don't know how to clean it ourselves or how to build sewage, irrigation, or water systems. We scramble for shelter, unsure how to repurpose materials to build our own. Under capitalism, if we wanted to learn these skills, the policy landscape is intentionally designed to make it difficult, so that corporations can build profits by our manufactured dependence. Private ownership of land and other land policies, for example, make it incredibly difficult to cultivate land to grow and build on. A super interesting illustration of how business logic organizes our approach to the zombie apocalypse genre can be found in the game Death Road. By bucking the military shooter trend and taking the form of a resource management sim where you manage time, assets, people, and morale, Death Road, as Kaylin Smith writes, explores how the zombie apocalypse game genre may appear chaotic, but is in fact efficiently ordered by neoliberal rationality. The chaos of the zombie game is more akin to the neoliberal fantasy of the unregulated free market, no longer restricted by the state. Why do the characters in this genre always describe what's happening as the end of the world? It's giving capitalist realism, the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Libertarianism is certainly present within the Walking Dead comics and TV series, where the police, primarily through the character of Rick Grimes, are valorized. Private property has ceased to exist with the collapse of capitalist institutions, but people's ideological investment in capitalism has not. Characters like Rick and his frenemy Shane Walsh exemplify the belief that a man's family, his property if you will, should be protected at any cost, even to the detriment of others. Herschel Green is introduced as a character who values his property, his farm, above all, and is ready to kick the many others made houseless by the zombie apocalypse off his land, because it is his land, and nothing is more important than that. And Herschel isn't exactly portrayed as a villain in the show or comics, but an anti-hero at worst, noble savior at best. Perhaps less so in the Telltale game, where he really does just come across as a suspicious, racist prick, but we'll talk about that later. So, zombies clearly symbolize a threat to both the nation-state and the global capitalist order. This is so much the case that international politics professor Daniel Dresner infamously wrote a book called Theories of International Politics and Zombies, in which he theorizes what different foreign policy responses to a zombie apocalypse would be. Jason Morissette writes that woven throughout Dresner's analysis is the underlying fictional assumption that zombies, as depicted in works of popular culture, constitute an existential threat to the state, creating a security environment in which war with the undead is virtually inevitable. That is, Dresner's work presents the state as the object that is to be secured from zombies at any cost. It's not concerned with human security or about humanizing and assisting the infected, or the security of any other kind of life. The crisis isn't, for example, presented as a medical or humanitarian or political crisis. The securitization of something is the process of framing it as a threat to security, even an existential threat to the state. The securitization of the zombie crisis implies that it's being framed as a security issue rather than, say, a medical, public health, humanitarian, or political issue. The rhetoric of securitization which underscores the zombie crisis, of which World War Z is a fantastic/horrible example, is linked to the zombification we talked about earlier. In other words, an issue being securitized goes hand in hand with the zombification of certain groups and justifies perpetual wars. You know, like the war on drugs or the war on terror. The war on zombies justifies oppressive, violent state measures leading to a lot of the catastrophe we see in zombie fiction, just as the perpetual war on drugs and terrorism is justification for the mass incarceration, forced labor, and genocide of Black, Muslim, and other communities. What's particularly interesting about the zombie apocalypse genre in this regard is the reversal of power dynamics that occurs. When I was streaming Telltale's The Walking Dead, I was actively comparing a lot of the stuff happening in the game to what people are going through right now in Gaza and across Palestine. And this is just it. The zombie apocalypse genre often stages these scenarios where things that really happen to people in the global south as a result of the global colonial capitalist order are now happening to us in the imperial core. Fred Botting points out in his reading of 28 Weeks Later that occupied and under reconstruction, Britain, it seems, is no different from any country in the world, no more privileged or more secure than, say, Iraq or Afghanistan. Turning an erstwhile global financial center into a refugee camp stages a striking reversal. Like the Haitian zombie struck fear into the hearts of white men, the fear of being subjected to the same fate as enslaved Haitians, so the modern zombie strikes fear into the hearts of those of us that live comfortable lives in the global north, and ignore the suffering caused in the rest of the world in order to secure that comfort and our silence. The libertarian fantasy of the zombie apocalypse genre is embodied not only by the disappearance of the state, but the becoming of the state. As players, we either serve the state as actual military personnel, or if the state has collapsed, the individual becomes the state, exercising the violent, militaristic right to protect itself. In the Walking Dead TV show and comics, this is seen from the collapse of the old to the changing regimes of the new communities formed. First, the heightening through military responses to the outbreak, then the failure of state institutions, followed by people forming small groups, engaging in smaller scales of violence as they scavenge and survive. Finally, they begin to form larger communities, resulting in a heightened need for walls, militarization, and security, not only against zombies, but against other human beings who seek only to steal from and exploit each other. Now, of course, all this means that zombie media can reflect and perpetuate, yes, but also challenge classism, disableism, and racism. In particular, a couple of well-known zombie game franchises have partly garnered a reputation for their more critical political perspective. A more socially conscious zombie trope can be found in the trend of the big bad pharmaceutical company that caused the virus, a trope most notoriously delivered in Capcom's Resident Evil. In Resident Evil, the big bad is Umbrella Corporation, a multinational pharmaceutical company secretly involved in the development of biological weapons to sell to the US military, but also to fund its eugenicist aims, the creation of a race of superhumans and the genocide of lesser humans. But Resident Evil has a strong strain of propaganda which undercuts this political narrative. The big bad pharmaceutical company is not necessarily understood as part of a medical industrial complex, wherein medicine, particularly privatized profit-driven medicine, is protected by state institutions like the government, military, and police. As if it were, you might not spend the majority of Resident Evil games playing nervous rookie or seasoned badass cops and anti-terrorist agents, rendered as noble and heroic in the face of corrupt but redeemable organizations. Dead Rising, Capcom's other notable zombie-related IP, was developed to be Resident Evil's polar opposite in many ways, but it similarly offers a striking political narrative amidst its generally fun, campy, and over-the-top tone. Neither Dead Rising nor Resident Evil really are zombie apocalypses, which is interesting. Here, capitalist individualist American society actually survives and adapts, and zombieism is a result of its most extreme ills. In contrast to the high-powered survivalist police officers of Resident Evil, in Dead Rising you tend to play as some average guy using odds and ends to fight zombies as well as you can. Thank God for the Second Amendment, right? In the first game, you play as a photojournalist, Frank West, come to cover the story of mysterious mass violence occurring in a shopping mall in Willamette, Colorado. The main villain appears to be Carlito, a racialized man from the Latin American town of Santa Cabeza, which was decimated by a zombie virus as a result of American government-funded research facilities working on mutations for cattle in the hopes of facilitating accelerated meat production, therefore increasing profits. So, factory farming is the big bad. When Contagion escapes the labs, infecting and zombifying the citizens of Santa Cabeza, the US military are brought in to wipe out the town. The destruction of Santa Cabeza is covered up with a racist story about drug-related violence, and Carlito wants revenge. Honestly, who can blame him? Frank insists on characterizing Carlito as a terrorist, which makes me pretty concerned about his journalistic coverage of wars.
I've covered wars, you know.
While Carlito is constantly painted with this racist trope of terrorist, an irredeemable except in death so-called psychopath, well-meaning Homeland Security agents Brad and Jesse tragically perish when the American government sends the military in to wipe everyone out. Not just zombies, but people. Dead Rising's true ending takes an incredibly bleak note, and the Willamette outbreak leads to further outbreaks across the country. By the time of Dead Rising 2, American individualist capitalism has not only survived, but is thriving, having adapted to the zombie outbreaks. Carlito's sister, Isabella, develops a drug which can offset the effects of the zombie virus, which becomes trademarked and mass-produced by the pharmaceutical company Phenotrans under the name Zombrex. Infected Americans have become reliant on Zombrex, which has to be taken at least every 24 hours if they want to avoid turning. And when Phenotrans becomes concerned that people aren't buying as much Zombrex as they used to, they engineer further outbreaks to drive up profits. The final boss of the game, Sullivan, justifies the plot by saying that America's best are infected and need access to Zombrex, so the sacrifice is necessary. Sound the eugenics klaxon. But Dead Rising 2 throws an interesting curveball our way. This adaptation of American capitalism to zombification has resulted in a phenomenon where disenfranchised zombies are being exploited for entertainment. The main playable character, Chuck Green, is a motorcyclist forced to compete in a game show called Terror is Reality, where contestants massacre as many zombies as possible for kicks. Chuck needs the money to buy expensive Zombrex for his infected daughter, Katie, but he's sympathetic to a group called CURE, Citizens for Undead Rights and Equality, who campaign against Terror is Reality and all forms of unethical treatment of zombies, believing that they are simply infected people who deserve to be treated with dignity. CURE aren't against the necessity of killing zombies in self-defense, but they are opposed to the systematic exploitation of zombies for entertainment, and they are falsely accused of causing the outbreak, labeled shock horror, as terrorists. Capcom is, of course, a Japanese company, and it's curious that its two major zombie franchises would be so concerned with the evils of American capitalism and individualism. Several moments, especially in Dead Rising, openly satirize the bloodthirstiness, violence, and greed of American society, but in Dead Rising, zombieism and its political trappings seem cast as a quintessentially American ill. In Resident Evil, capitalism may be more of a global ill, but Americans as our world police are once more our saviors. As with Resident Evil, there are certain contradictions that plague Dead Rising's narratives. For example, its campiness is sometimes reliant on blatant misogynistic exploitation of flat female characters for sex appeal, and its villains are flippantly designated as psychopaths in ways which are colored, varied, but across the board troubling. American capitalism is critiqued through fat-phobic images of greed, which are tired and violent tropes, which perpetuate a kind of violence, fat phobia, which is both classist and racist in nature. Inspired by George Romero's quintessential zombie films, the body of the zombie stands in for the mindless consumer, roaming endlessly around a shopping mall. Both Resident Evil and Dead Rising are plagued by the problem of ludonarrative dissonance, or a contradiction between what the narrative is trying to say and what the game is asking you to do. As I argued of Resident Evil 5 in another video, your African zombies are pitiable but ultimately fodder for your gun. In Dead Rising, sympathy for an organization like Cure is starkly contrasted to general zombie massacre gameplay, including the option to play terror as reality for cash. The amount of zombies you kill is even rewarded with trophies that call you a genocide master. Like, holy shit! Kaylin Smith also points out that one of the main appeals of the Dead Rising series is its wide array of often ridiculous methods for zombie disposal, all of which contribute to the series' simultaneous mocking and indulgence of consumerism. Dead Rising in this way critiques capitalist consumption through parody, while simultaneously allowing the player to indulge in capitalist consumptive fantasies. And ultimately, of course, because of Capcom's dedication to producing further Resident Evil and Dead Rising titles, ironically for their own business model, these worlds of zombie-related woe have no end in sight. So where that leaves the revolution, who knows? Whew. Now let's get into The Walking Dead, shall we? There is no singular thing called masculinity, and black masculinity is no different. Better thought of as masculinities, they're diverse, plural, and sometimes even subversive, not always belonging to men, for example. But there's often a difference between what black masculinities really are and what black masculinity as a monolithic idea created by white supremacy is. This white supremacist idea of black masculinity is usually the racial and gendered characterization of black men as aggressive, criminal, and barbaric. In video games, black men are underrepresented overall, but where they are represented, it's usually as gangsters, athletes, or support characters, cementing associations of black men with criminality, physical strength and aggression, and cementing their marginal place. One gendered white supremacist trope about black men is that they're bad, abusive, or absent fathers, for example. In reality, studies show social fathering is common in African American and low-income homes, which are more likely to be run by a single parent. A CDC study from 2013 found that black fathers that are separate from their children are as involved, if not more so, with their children than fathers of other races. The same is true for black fathers who live with their families. Nevertheless, the deadbeat black dad trope alongside the unfit black mother trope is often used to justify the separation of black families by the state. For more detail on that, check out our video on Life is Strange: True Colors. Telltale's The Walking Dead feels like it critically, even intentionally, engages with these racial tropes about black men. It's common knowledge, widely researched and recorded, that gaming is a hypermasculine white space, and most popular games are centered around hypermasculine power fantasies in narrative and in gameplay. Certain genres, military shooters, RPGs, third-person action-adventure, are associated with masculinity, partly because of the physical prowess performed by the avatar, and partly because the geek masculinity of the assumed player is constructed through mastery of games, if not physical athletics. Other genres are socially constructed as more feminine, a topic we'll return to in future videos, because you might not need any sort of technical mastery to progress and to complete the game, or because the game focuses more on story, character, and other elements, as opposed to enacting violence or domination. Black boys and men are alienated from geek masculinity because black families are less likely to have a personal computer or console due to their economic conditions. That's actually part of the reason black men are statistically more likely to play sports than video games. A neighborhood basketball court is free. When they do play games, they're more likely to play social games in social contexts, like at their friend's house if they're the one kid in the neighborhood who does have a PlayStation. In the first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead, you play as a black American ex-history professor, Lee Everett. This is a huge contrast to the mainstream Walking Dead comic and TV series, which follows the central character of Rick Grimes, a white ex-cop who very much at all times approaches everything like a cop and is valorized for it. As Trey Andrea Russworm writes, the first season of Telltale's game inverts the franchise's racial power dynamic by weaving the story and game's principal action around black college professor and father figure Lee Everett. This inversion is not only because Lee is a black man as opposed to the white Rick, but because cops serve the institution of policing, which systematically criminalizes and murders black men. In the American context, modern-day policing is traced back to the 1700s slave patrols, which terrorized black people and aimed to quash rebellion by hunting and catching enslaved people to return them to servitude. If you've watched my video Institutional Racism in Life is Strange 2, you might see a connection there as well, in how that game portrays the police hunting the Wolf brothers, and the connection made between vigilante immigrant hunters and the institution of policing. Now, zombie games, as I've described, generally lie firmly within the hypermasculine colonial power fantasy category by being near synonymous with first-person military shooters or with third-person action-adventure games in which survival and resource management encourage a sense of mastery or prowess. But Telltale's The Walking Dead occupies a totally different genre, the episodic narrative point-and-click adventure. This genre, including games like Life is Strange or Tell Me Why, is more marginal to geek masculinity, associated with angry dykes who are bad at games, like me. Point-and-click episodic narrative games place less emphasis on violence, power, and mastery, and more on narrative, character, and relationship building, with a heavy dose of moral quandary. You can't die unless the game tells you it's time to die, and you don't have to be particularly good at headshots or anything most traditional zombie games place emphasis on. In other zombie games, your problems are solved by violently carving out a bloody path, or masterfully sneaking around it, cleverly managing resources along the way. In Telltale's The Walking Dead, you'll occasionally defend yourself from a zombie, occasionally having the option to kill them for fun and games even, but your gameplay is generally not defined by pioneering colonial masculine labor. Instead, it's defined by feminized and pathetic labor, managing group conflicts, taking care of children, making split-second decisions that never quite feel right. Most zombie apocalypse games tell us that what's important is resource management, fighting, all the stuff we've gone over, linked to capitalist individualism, business management, and libertarianism. But as Oliver Perez-Latore puts it, The Walking Dead constantly confronts the player with moral dilemmas, suggesting that our moral principles and decisions matter even more in crises or post-apocalyptic scenarios. It's almost impossible, I think, to play Telltale's The Walking Dead and feel any sense of mastery. This means your performance of Lee's masculinity, regardless of your choices, already undermines geek masculinity and white supremacist depictions of black masculinity. But a lot of people do have difficulty playing this game, and it isn't because it's hardcore in a technical sense, but because practicing empathy and making tough choices in tough situations is, well, it's hard. Another relevant video game trope for The Walking Dead is the dadification of video games. In this trope, there's a father figure, usually a white dude player character, and a daughter figure that you must protect. She's also usually white. But traditionally in these games, your dadness is rooted in, as Christina Bell, Nicholas Taylor, and Christopher Camp put it, violent, ruggedly individualistic, and hegemonically masculine fatherhood. By contrast, they write, Telltale's The Walking Dead rewards a fatherhood rooted in non-violence, nurture, and self-sacrifice, gendered characteristics that are commonly categorized as feminine. Importantly, Lee isn't a savior or protector, as the idea of saving or protecting others often entails stripping agency from the saved or protected. For example, in colonial dynamics, the white savior of the uncivilized savage, and gendered dynamics, the strong male protector of the meek damsel in distress. In Telltale's The Walking Dead, Lee escapes a prison-bound cop car and crashes near a house where the only survivor is an 8-year-old girl hiding in a treehouse waiting for her parents, who will never come. Lee, with no relationships left to salvage and little to keep him going, becomes Clementine's father figure. Very quickly, Clem and Lee meet other families to compare themselves to. White, mustachioed Florida fisherman Kenny is obsessed with the protection of his family, and this single-minded fixation operates as his personal justification to be violent, manipulative, or negligent to others. I mean, he's not even that nice or attentive to the wife or child he claims to protect, but that's by the by, I guess. Kenny's wants and needs are supreme, and once he sets his mind on something, he never listens to anyone, even violently and aggressively responding to their attempts to reason with him or think about other people, like, at all. After losing his wife and child tragically in episode 3, he still uses them, specifically his trauma over their loss, as his personal justification to be violent, manipulative, or negligent to others. The other father-daughter duo, other than Lee and Clementine, is the racist ex-military powerhouse Larry and his I'm not racist but I let my racist dad do whatever he wants daughter, Lily, also ex-military in her father's footsteps, certainly enough to know her way around a gun and around military ideology. Lee, never having been a parent himself, with his own family gone and little to model himself after, does his best as he goes along. It isn't until Lee meets the drifter Chuck that he shifts his parenting strategy from one of mere protection to one of empowerment. Chuck tells Lee that he needs to prepare Clementine for his possible death by teaching her to protect herself as well as she can with a pistol and a short, practical haircut. Lee learns just in time that being a healthy parent is not about paternalistically protecting Clementine in a way that strips her of agency, but about teaching her to think and act for herself. And Clementine will learn the same lesson later. The game rewards you for trusting Clem and for listening to and being honest with her, which she responds to more positively than when she feels ignored, sidelined, or lied to. I've talked about a lack of mastery in the traditional sense, and Telltale's The Walking Dead often leaves you feeling that you've failed in some way. This is often attributed to the fact that in dire circumstances there is no right decision, and of course there's no rule book on how to be some perfect model parent. Both of these things are true enough, but a gaming experience characterized by a lack of control is not only significant for subverting hyper and geek masculinity, which is all about control and power, but for drawing attention to the specific experiences of black men. At certain vital points in the narrative of Telltale's The Walking Dead, you in fact have no control over what Lee says or does, mostly during non-interactive cutscenes, but sometimes during play. You may attempt to make him say something, and Lee may say something else entirely, or nothing at all.
I got into a fight once.
One scene where he's looking for Clementine, if you take a leisurely stroll and stop to look at objects, Lee says,
I don't care about that. I just want to find Clementine.
Here we might read Lee, the black male avatar, resisting you, the player, attempting to control or even colonize him, the player, the zombie master, and Lee, the zombie. This reading becomes particularly powerful when we consider Trey Andrea Russworm's argument that in The Walking Dead, Lee's relationship with Clementine is the emotional core of the game, which maintains empathy for Lee throughout. He is programmed and designed to be an empathetic black father figure, because regardless of how the player exercises their limited control of him, he remains, overall, empathetic and caring towards Clementine. In harsher or more emotionally closed interactions, you still see a black man in a fatherly role, wanting, trying, and struggling to care for her, and this still invokes empathy for Lee, resisting, as Russworm puts it, a powerful critical retraction of the dominant negative imagery around black fathers as irresponsible, incompetent, and absentee. The idea of illusory agency and false choice in video games like this has often been criticized. Other than the obvious fact that to understand how game development works is to understand that games are necessarily limited, this criticism is usually because players want to feel in control. We've already talked a bit about the racial and gendered aspect of this desire for control, but I want to think about illusory or false choice in games as an opportunity to read racialized, gendered, disabled, or classed experiences of powerlessness under a capitalist society, which constantly tells us that we have the freedom to choose when we don't. In particular, I want to talk about this lack of control in terms of the perception of black men as opposed to their material experience and positionality. In Telltale's The Walking Dead, Lee is established as a violent criminal, the quintessential zombified, i.e. killable, black man. Before the events of the game, he's a middle-class black man with a job as a professor at a university. Lee's voice actor, Dave Fennoy, has talked about intentionally conveying this in Lee's voice. But after he's imprisoned for murder, Lee experiences social death. Now marked for incarceration, forced labor, and exclusion from society, no longer an assimilated black citizen of the American state. Interesting that Lee learns the lessons he does from Chuck, who, as a houseless drifter, ranks among the socially dead. With this in mind, we could actually say that, metaphorically, Lee's zombification occurs at the start rather than the end of the game, when he's on his way to prison. You could actually compare this with the image of the zombie in Life is Strange 2, a game very explicitly about the racist American police state. Young Daniel Diaz is dressed as a zombie when he's perceived as a racial threat, and attacked by his racist neighbor before a white cop pulls over and murders his father. Sean and Daniel survive, in a sense, but experience social death when they stop being included as assimilated citizens of the American state. They are now zombies, houseless, criminalized, and marked for death. Throughout the Walking Dead game, others will perceive Lee as an aggressive black criminal, and there is little to do to affect this perception. No matter how you act, whether you are the sacrificial black saint beloved of liberals, loved only when you passively accept death, or whether you alienate everyone around you except Clementine, no matter if your motivations are selfish capitalist individualism or reasonable anger towards racial violence. If you're a jerk, characters might comment about how they were right about you, how your behavior confirms the beliefs they had about you all along. But even if you're a veritable angel, they're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. The only characters who have Lee's back pretty consistently, even if they don't necessarily agree with him 100% of the time, are notably mostly racialized people. Carly, Omid, and Krista, who's a little rough around the edges but warms up to Lee when it matters most. By contrast, no matter how many times I play this game, all it takes is one disagreement with Kenny for him to turn on Lee like a handlebar mustachioed Floridian Judas, to the point that he leaves Lee to die twice. Kenny refuses to ever take personal responsibility for his actions, constantly blaming everything on Lee, even potentially physically assaulting him, because he's an easy scapegoat. Kenny's revealing comments associating Lee with criminality.
Hey, Lee, you know how to pick a lock, right?
No. Why would you say that?
Well, you're, urban?
Oh, you are not saying what I think you're saying.
And with black professionalism.
All right, Professor, what'd you have in mind?
Show that he has racist beliefs about Lee, which of course characterize this behavior of targeting him and scapegoating him. Class adds a dimension too, because Kenny seems to resent Lee's class position, which should belong to a deserving white person like him, and tries to reconcile this with his mental image of a working class, criminal, violent black man. Kenny shows a similar sort of resentment towards Carlos in Season 2, his entitled white masculinity under attack by Carlos's intelligence.
Regardless of intent, there are consequences to rash actions. Something that he seems to be misreading as capitulation.
Yeah.
I don't know what the fuck you're saying, but I know it's bullshit.
Notably, neither of these men of color actually belittle Kenny or treat him in a classist way. They are simply trying to communicate with the group and assert their point of view at any given time, and Kenny considers their intelligence to be a threat that triggers his insecurity. Is this why Kenny gravitates towards Lee? Because he thinks black men's supposed aggression and criminality are useful skill sets for a zombie apocalypse?
Well, Macon's on the way, and personally, I'd appreciate the company of a guy who can knock a couple of heads together if he has to.
He's happy to use Lee if he can, but because he fundamentally sees him through a racial trope, he's ready to throw him under the bus if he thinks the moment calls for it. I mean, God forbid that useful, violent criminal skill set turn on Kenny. Oh. Kenny not only views Lee as aggressive and criminal, but makes the racist assumption that Lee will support and assist him without question, which, definitely betrays an internalized idea of black people as unthinking assistants, servants, slaves. Kenny always seems shocked as well as horrified when Lee doesn't help or follow him, because he simply can't imagine that Lee might have his own thoughts, beliefs, desires, or needs. Equally, Kenny relies on Lee because he often can't do what needs to be done. He can't face his son's infection, can't kill him unless pushed, can't pull off his stupid fucking boat plan without help. But instead of exercising empathy to encourage people to trust and help him, he bullies everyone, especially Lee, into accommodating him. Starkly, he does this without being villainized the way that Lee is for even the tiniest display of anger or poor judgment. And in the end, Kenny is a hypocrite too. He denies Ducks turning into a walker, putting everyone in danger, but he callously advocates for killing Larry and even Lee. And look, I fucking hate Larry, but I still didn't think he deserved that. The language that he and his daughter Lily use about people being parasites and mouths to feed.
Those parasites you guys brought back need to go.
I want to know why you thought bringing more mouths to feed was a good idea.
Is linked to eugenics in the game itself when the same language is used to describe the attitude of the eugenicist cult, Crawford, which rejects burdensome prospective citizens, i.e. children, the disabled, and the elderly. Larry only ever sees Lee as a violent criminal and a threat, claiming this racial caricature is who Lee really is. Ironically, of course, while holding Lee responsible for being a convicted murderer, Larry has no problem with advocating for the murder of Duck, a child, based on a hunch. After Lee spearheads the effort to find nitroglycerin pills to save Larry's life, Larry still tries to knock him out and leave him behind at the drugstore, even though Kenny has been his main adversary in the fight over Duck's life. It's clear that Larry's targeting of Lee is racist. He doesn't even do a particularly good job of denying it later, if Mark decides to be a fucking jerk and tell Larry what I told him in confidence about thinking that Larry is racist. Larry's racism is perhaps most stark, though a bit subtler, when he tells Lee to stay away from his daughter Lily, and to stay away from Clem.
Only thing
It's his
I
fault.
have to do is protect my daughter. Like my daughter?
Not really.
Good. Stay away from her. Or everyone here knows that Lee Everett is a killer. And I'm not talking about those things out there. You hear me? I asked you a question, boy. Then again, I wouldn't expect a convicted murderer to listen to anything anybody's got to say.
Fucking knew he was a racist too.
I know who you are. And I don't give a shit about what happens to you. But if anything happens to my daughter or that little girl you've got with you, you watch your ass.
You don't care about that little girl. Not only is Larry shitty to his own daughter, which she elaborates further on in the final season, he never shows any care or compassion towards Clem, doesn't even exchange words with her in the first 2 episodes. What he really cares about is mobilizing the trope of black men as sexual threats to white women, in this case his daughter Lily, and using Clem for his narrative of Lee as a deadbeat or unfit black dad, discounting her autonomy, her love for Lee, and her desire to stay with him. You might say that Lee needs mastery not of combat, scavenging, or other commonly regarded survival skills, but of interpersonal communication and decision-making, that feminized labor I've been talking about. This no doubt reflects the day-to-day survival of black men and of other racialized people. Because Lee is instantly perceived as a threat, if he cannot masterfully convince them of the opposite and humanize himself to them, he is gravely in danger. In practice, Lee's power over the group is incredibly limited, and there are various occasions where they will do what they want regardless, something which highly contrasts games where the gameplay promotes direct and exact control over the behavior of NPCs, which has its own trappings of stripping agency away from these NPCs. The game shows us that even behaving as the perfect sacrificial black saint, Lee simply cannot change others' perception of him. The game's false choice paradigm, the feeling of hopelessness evoked by the fact that your choices will not change Lee's fate, is, intentionally or not, really powerful in conveying Lee's racialized experience, particularly in the context of being houseless, starving, and materially disenfranchised in this way. The feeling of powerlessness that this game evokes is, powerful. It's the main antagonist of the season, the stranger, that really brings this theme home. He decides that Lee is a bad father and gives him the role of villain in his story, regardless of what you choose. At the end of episode 2, the group that Lee and Clementine are with decide to steal from an abandoned station wagon in the forest. The player, as Lee, can choose to advocate for this, which Clementine and others will disapprove of, or you can choose to oppose the decision, in which case the others will tell you that it's necessary to do it, and they'll steal anyway. This station wagon belonged to the stranger, whose family collapsed as a result after the food and supplies were stolen. The stranger, after the death and disappearance of his wife and children, blames Lee, regardless of what you as Lee actually choose. Specifically, he decides that Lee is unfit to be a father to Clementine, even to the point he says he'd rather kill Clementine himself than let her go with Lee. What's fascinating is that Duck, the other child and the only white child in the group, is neutral and has an assumed to be fit white father, Kenny. Lee, on the other hand, must be an unfit father, and the white stranger believes that he can do better. Ironically, neither the stranger nor Kenny were able to protect their children, while Lee's kid is still alive. Now, the Lee and Clementine relationship works to counteract the initial staging of Lee as a violent criminal, someone we might immediately zombify, and raises him from the dead, so to speak, humanizing him. Well, if not for the other characters, then certainly for most players, as countless reviews and fan reactions account for. But should we take the humanizing power of this relationship for granted? The game opens with Lee handcuffed in the back of a cop car on his way to prison. We don't have much information about this scenario other than the fact that Lee's wife had an affair with the state senator, Lee killed the state senator, and now he's on his way to prison. The scene of Lee's zombification and social death is the staging for the game and for the zombie apocalypse. Throughout the game, your choices always constitute some kind of dialogue with this racialized, gendered construction of Lee as a zombified black criminal aggressor, though what you're actually looking at is him, powerless. The game ends with Lee handcuffed again, a police officer in his way, again, or in Clementine's way. Now he's literally zombified. His fate as a black man in this world is sealed. Trey Andrea Russworm writes, "Despite all that Lee and Clementine's bond has signified up until this point, Lee's redemptive and punitive relationship to the prison industrial complex returns from the dead to fatally subordinate the intersubjective bond between the two characters, returning the black masculine subject back to his depressive and inevitable relationship to the state. Only this time, rather than function as a signifier for a generalized threat to society, as he did riding in a police cruiser at the start of the game, Lee is refigured here as a specific threat to the only person with whom he has established reciprocal love." My reading of this thematic and visual circle is personally colored by my knowledge of what comes in future seasons, how Clementine's story will develop. Lee's fate is tragically sealed, perhaps because it hasn't been long enough for people to change, for the world to change. Everyone carries their colonized minds into the new age. As capitalist institutions crumble around them, many people only reproduce their ideologies, showing us that a catastrophic event like a zombie apocalypse isn't enough to change the world. We all, each and every one of us, have to change too. As such, maybe it's just too soon after the apocalypse for Lee to survive. In these communities haunted by the old world and its violence, men like Lee remain doomed, and Lee's body, marked for death, finally reaches this grim destination. But Clementine, as part of a new generation of marginalized kids banding together, will be part of the project of building a different world. Now, many people come to question their own ideas of black masculinity by enacting Lee's subversion of the violent, aggressive criminal type with non-violence, negotiation, and care. A lot of people describe Lee's story as a redemption, but does he need to be redeemed? Further to the point, can we only humanize black men when they perform these sorts of non-normative masculinity? What if they aren't perfect victims? What if they have every right to be angry? What if their violence is justified? What if they are criminals, but it's their criminalization which is the problem? In the first place, we have to understand that not all violence is the same. The violence of a black man acting in self-defense is not the violence of a racist state. Why do we assume the worst about a black man killing a state senator? What were the circumstances of that murder? And why is an individual killing violent, but not the systematic violence of impoverishing and imprisoning black men? How should Lee be expected to trust people who never trust him? Is he only human if he turns the other cheek to racist Larry, Kenny, Lily, the stranger? Doesn't he have every reason to be as angry as he is?
It's his deal with Clem. It's everything. It's put this rage inside me like I can't even say.
Trey Andrea Russworm points out that even when Lee and Kenny do have conflict, the game's story eschews diegetic opportunities for more pointed critique in order to keep the project of building empathy and solidarity between the two characters open. The player does not have a chance to push the issue further and challenge the way Kenny equates blackness and criminality, especially since Lee's backstory has already cemented that association. Anyone who watched me stream this game knows how many times I wanted to kick Kenny in the teeth, or at least give him a stern telling off, but never had the chance. Oh my god, Kenny, you fucking prick! I swear to fucking god, Kenny. Kenny, you piece of shit. If it's between someone else and Kenny, Kenny is fucking dead. Kenny, fucking racist fucking prick. Lee isn't given much of an opportunity to challenge or oppose the racism he faces from these characters because if he did, these relationships might fall apart. Meaning, black characters are expected to swallow racism and accept these forms of violence in order to facilitate group cohesion, rather than the onus being on characters like Larry and Kenny to do the internal work to challenge and unlearn their racism. Ultimately, there's a huge difference between white and racialized, in this case black, masculinities. White cisgender heterosexual masculinity is hegemonic, a fancy word meaning it's dominant in our political context. This means it's part of a structure which enforces systematized violence against women, children, people of color, and queer people. Subverting or undermining this kind of masculinity, which is beautifully achieved in Firewatch, for example, means subverting something that upholds a violent structure, a system under which genocide, mass incarceration, and institutionalization, domestic violence, and more are normalized. Crucially, hegemonic white masculinity is not a set of tropes mobilized to commit violence against white men. It is a set of tropes mobilized for white men to commit violence against others. Meanwhile, white supremacist constructions of black masculinity are mobilized to commit violence against black men. Black men's supposed aggression is the reason given for police brutality and killings. Racialized men's barbarism and terrorism is the reason given to commit genocide in Palestine. Of course, black men are men, very much capable of partaking in violence against women and queer people. That's an important and nuanced topic. But equally, nothing is a justification for the violence they face. That's right, there is no justification. Black men and other racialized men have every reason to be angry, and it's no coincidence that their anger is characterized as a threat, because anger at injustice leads to resistance to white supremacy and colonization. As far as criminality is concerned, we shouldn't think of people as criminals, but rather as criminalized. Simply, breaking the law doesn't make you evil. Criminality isn't some sort of identity or pathology, it just means that you've broken the law. Many laws are designed precisely to criminalize black men and others, to create socially dead populations, to fill prisons, to be exploited for labor, to be trapped in a cycle unable to get work, housing, money, therefore likely to return to prison. Prisons disappear black men from society, simultaneously removing the threat of black resistance and oozing profit for government and corporations. Lee, convicted of a violent crime in handcuffs on his way to prison at the beginning of this game, is offered a second chance precisely because of the zombie apocalypse's destruction of the prison industrial complex. It is the destruction of the US state institutions which gives Lee a second chance at life, if only a short one. For now, American minds remain colonized. When I first played The Walking Dead, I picked up Clementine's family photo, of her with her mother and her father, a woman of color and a black man. We never learn more about Clementine's mother or her background, but we do know that when Clementine first sees Lee walking into her house and looking for someone with a nervous,
Coming in. Don't shoot, okay?
she thinks it's her father. This moment of a black man walking into a house and asking not to be shot, trying to qualify that he's not a threat, is certainly familiar. Maybe to Clementine, whose father is black, it's something she recognizes too. There's some of that recognition there later on, when Herschel suspiciously asks her,
Honey, do you know this man?
"Oh my god." And she looks nervous, but calmly replies,
Yes.
Before Clem and Lee speak for the first time, you hear her mother's voice on the phone, addressing Clem's babysitter, Sandra.
Hey, Sandra, this is Diana. We're still in Savannah. Ed had a little incident with some crazy guy near the hotel, so we had to get him back to the ER and have it checked out. Anyway, he's not feeling well enough to drive back tonight, so we're staying an extra day. Thanks so much for looking after Clementine, and I promise we'll be back in time before your spring break.
When I first heard this, I immediately thought that Clementine's father had been the victim of a racially motivated attack. Maybe because I remembered being a little brown girl myself, watching things happen to my family that I quickly had to learn to understand. Yeah, this crazy guy was probably a zombie, but I still think that either or both could be true. In the end, we never hear the voice of the father that Clementine lost first, but we do hear Lee's. Clementine is a racialized girl. This is a fact that is apparently a topic of controversy among players of The Walking Dead. Yup. Emma Ray, in her study of children in games, explains it like this. If a child character's purpose is to elicit a protective or affectionate response from the presumed white player, then blackness reduces the stereotype's functionality. The friction between a character's identity as a child and its racialized identity suggests the two identities are perceived by some as mutually exclusive. Online debates in fan spaces about the racial identity of the child character Clementine from the Walking Dead series, for example, repeatedly query and rewrite her blackness. This is just one of many, but here's the example cited in the essay. One fandom user wrote, "Why is Clementine listed as African American on her wiki page? I don't remember any mention of it in the game, and she looks more Asian or Caucasian to me." Another commented on the same thread, "She's Blasian," prompting a heated discussion as to whether two black parents could biologically produce an Asian child. Similar conversations were taking place years earlier. In 2014, for example, a commenter opined, "I think Telltale intended for her to be a-racial. The fact people are claiming her race is unbacked and unproven." As I've just shown, that's categorically untrue within the game as a text, but if you needed to hear authorial intent from the horse's mouth, Sean Vanneman and Jake Rodkin, lead writers of Season 1, have confirmed that Clementine is mixed race.
The Walking Dead is a game that's not about race, but it would be very naive to say that race does not play a role in the politics of the game. The Walking Dead features a black man in a leading role, but the theme is not about race, but it has to feature the politics of race in the game context, to be honest. And the selection of race is a game design choice that you make in your game as a designer, because it is creating the context that we've been talking about before. So the game, is asking you to carry Lee's personal experience with you along with the experience that you're going to go on to define for him. We thought about the specific events in his day where race did matter. We thought about what set him off. We thought about how he responded to aggression, how far he could be pushed, all of these things. Furthermore, the same kind of goes for Clementine. We've never said it, but Clementine is actually mixed race.
We don't know anything really about Clementine's ethnicity except her own American accent and her mother's on the phone. But this isn't information we need to know that Clementine is a racialized girl, because race and ethnicity are not the same thing. To hear about this in more depth, check out our Indigeneity in Games video, but in short, race is a social construct invented by white supremacists based on someone's physical features, like skin color, nose shape, hair texture, used to group and categorize people as superior and inferior, and to create classes to exploit, enslave, or kill. Your ethnicity is your cultural background. Not all black people are the same ethnicity, so we don't even know for sure the ethnicity of Clem's dad. Although, based on the parallels made between him and Lee, we have a good idea that he was racialized as black. All of this is really important because I went through hell reading all of this shit debating Clementine's race, and y'all are literally out here doing race science. Please. In the terms I've used in this essay, we could say that race marks people for death, whether it's the immediate death of police brutality, settler colonialism, or genocide, or the slow death of starvation, exhaustion, and poverty. What's important here is that if race is a social construct, racialization is a process. Clementine's racialization is evident in both game world responses to her character and fan responses to her character. In Season 1 of Telltale's The Walking Dead, vehement responses that deny Clem's race demonstrate that if one's emotional response to Clem is to like and want to protect her, she cannot be a brown or black girl. She must be white, or as someone bafflingly put it, aracial. From this very first season, fan responses to Clem insist that she is not like other girls, sometimes comparing her to other annoying child characters in games to justify why they like her. But why is Clementine not like other children? Other children are either sympathetic because they need protection, or annoying because they can't look after themselves. Clem, by contrast, is perceived as more adult. In The Walking Dead Definitive Edition, the developer commentary track reveals that the first season's lead writers, Sean Vanneman and Jake Rodkin, told their team to think of Clem as an adult, partly to help them avoid characterizing her as a child character through the usual tropes. The team had decided to go with an adult voice actor, the talented Melissa Hutchinson, over a child actor, in comparison to Duck, whose voice actor was a child at the time of production. Duck, Kenny's son, very much falls into the realm of a supporting child character who serves to humanize another character. Kenny is consistently perceived to be justified in, or at least excused for, his actions in the first 2 seasons of this game, because he lost his wife and child, even though this child was barely characterized. You can certainly see in this foil between Duck and Clem that Clem might be afforded more appreciation or care because she is more mature or adult than Duck, which certainly reaffirms that children are seen as marginal. As I've pointed out, some fans vehemently deny Clem's racialization in order to see her as a child that they can like, but at the same time, this maturity of hers also invokes the adultification of racialized children. There's hints of this in the first season. It's sometimes expressed that Clem is hard to read by people paying attention, but Kenny starkly dismisses Clem's emotional state.
How's she doing?
Family's dead, so...
That's awful, Lee.
Yeah, well... She seems to be handling herself alright.
She's just a little girl, Ken.
Lee says she spent days on her own. That takes toughness.
But you have no idea what sort of emotional damage is happening to her every second her family is gone.
Which, yeah, dude. It didn't occur to you to be concerned about the emotional state of the child whose parents are missing, who was displaced from her home, who is witnessing apocalyptic horrors? It's worth pointing out, always, that the sort of child trauma experienced by Clementine from season 1 onwards is reminiscent of child trauma experienced by children in the world today, living in poverty, forced into child labor, living in colonized, occupied, and besieged areas, from the children of Congo to the children of Gaza. This is important because Westerners often enjoy media which imagines disaster situations happening to them while forgetting that it's happening to others right now, and in fact it's happening to them to secure our comfort as we speak. Even the oldest children, by legal definition, 18 years old in Gaza, have now lived their entire lives under such conditions, to the point that, for them, normality is a life which is constantly precarious, never knowing when they'll be able to eat or drink clean water, or when they or their loved ones might die. Most of them, like Clementine, have lost parents and have no home. This horrific normal has made the category PTSD defunct and has led to some of the highest rates of child suicidality in the world today. These realities are what we must keep in mind when we analyze characters like Clementine, whose comfort and normality is ruptured by the zombie apocalypse, and like AJ, her son, who knows no world other than continuous trauma. In season 1, it's taken for granted that Clementine serves as a moral compass for players. The game offers various indicators, including perhaps most strikingly the moment where Lee must choose between saving Doug and Carly, and Clem stands frightened in the middle of the frame. There are several other moments where Clem's reactions to decisions construct her as a key indicator as to the morality of your decisions as well. Even other characters are affected. For example, Krista initially, based on very little information, votes to remove Ben from the group, but when Clementine protests, with a guilty face, Krista changes her vote to an abstention.
Well, I vote we leave him. I'm sorry, Ben. I know you mean well. But all I want to do is get back to Omi, and you put that at risk.
Wait, don't I get a vote?
Of course you do.
Of course you do.
Ben's nice. He's my friend. We don't leave friends behind. That's my vote.
On second thought, I think I'm gonna abstain.
Aside from this, little attention is actually paid to Clem's character arc in the first season, where she's abstracted from her personhood and idealized by two particular characters, Jolene, a minor character in episode 2, and the major antagonist of the season, the Stranger. Jolene and the Stranger, perceiving Clem as an idealized aracial child at the same time as perceiving Lee as an unfit, villainous black father, callously attempt to separate her from her father figure, even though she vehemently doesn't want this, claiming that they could do better. This has resonances with the foster care system, as we discuss in depth in our video on Life is Strange: True Colors, which institutionalizes the separation of black children from their parents, and justifies this violence by claiming its interest is in protecting these children from their unfit parents. Clementine is not seen as a person with desires, which are to stay with Lee, who she loves, but as an object that needs protecting from the violent racial threat embodied by Lee, and she's de-racialized in order to be perceived that way. This dehumanizing portrayal of Clementine is starkly challenged in a wonderful moment where the Stranger tells the head of his dead wife how sweet and innocent Clem is, at the exact moment that she hits him from behind. Children are underrepresented in games, and when they are, it's through certain tropes. Emma Ray's study of representations of children in video games from 2009 to 2019 shows these trends through a study of 506 commercially successful and critically acclaimed games from this period, to show dominant trends in representations of children, here meaning below 14 years of age, and including non- or quasi-human children, because children are often associated with animals and toys, and without that, the figure would be even lower. Of these games, 65% did not include a single child character. 19% contained a significant child character, but less than 9% actually had child avatars, as in you could only play as a child in less than 9% of these games. In a significant amount of these games, a playable child was not a character in their own right, but a version of an overpowered adult protagonist in a flashback scene, usually showing some kind of trauma occurring to a now invincible adult as a vulnerable child to make you feel for them, perhaps even to justify the violence that they, and you as the player, commit against others as an adult. If the child is a hero in their own right, it usually needs to be explained why they're not like other children. Ironically, most representations of children appear in games with age ratings of at least 16+. In some games, as per the dadification of games, children serve to humanize a hypermasculine, usually white hero. Specifically, Ray argues the player is conditioned to behave in a more socially responsible and more emotionally vulnerable way as a result of characters like Ellie, Atreus, and Alice, who communicate through dialogue, body language, and impressively realistic motion capture facial expressions, the extent to which the player's interactions affect their well-being and their worldviews. In fact, Detroit Become Human is explicitly about the humanizing potential of adult-child relationships, with a non-human android guardian becoming human through her performance of maternal care and protection of the human child, Alice. Part of what's interesting about this is, as we've alluded to before, that often in doing so, these games approve irrational, feminized playstyles, less focused on power, control, or unemotional rationality, optimal resource management, and so on. Additionally, a child character might justify or explain your avatar's limits, because of course children are weak and powerless, or provide a blank slate to upgrade them from, creating seamless tutorials. They might also symbolize a non-violent playstyle or juxtapose the brutality of the game world. In turn, a game might exclude children or limit what you can do to children because of their moral significance. Meanwhile, an NPC killing a child could be an expression of their moral depravity. Ray summarizes, aptly, the fact that child characters simply do not exist in the majority of video games reflects children's exclusion from social, public, and professional spheres in contemporary Anglo-American society. The specific lack of playable child characters speaks to the idea of the child as object rather than subject, or as symbol rather than agent. Other than being a disempowered object or symbol rather than an agent, who is the child according to games? Most of these games depicted white male children between 6 and 11 years old, with playable characters mostly being male, while non-male children served some kind of support role, usually being a damsel in distress, a cheerleader, a sidekick, a trophy, or a caretaker. The kicker is that non- and quasi-human children are more likely to appear in these games than racialized children, which is... yeah. Season 2 of Telltale's The Walking Dead is a stark exception in this landscape. Clementine understandably looks like she's aged a decade in the mere 2 years that have passed since the first season, but in fact she is still only 11 years old. You wouldn't think so, based on the way she's treated. Or maybe you would, because she's brown. In our world, we see the adultification of racialized children in various ways. The way unarmed black boys are shot dead by armored cops who claim to see them as threatening adult men. The way racialized children of the global south and poor children of color of the global north are forced into dangerous labor conditions, while middle-class white kids play behind picket fences. The way Palestinian boys fill Israeli prisons. The way 6-year-old Hind Rajab was called a Palestinian woman by Western media when she was murdered by Israel. Clementine's race isn't overtly referred to in this season, or ever in the story really, the way that Lee's is in Season 1. But in Season 2, like Lee before her, Clem is consistently perceived and treated by strangers as a threat, again, regardless of how you as the player encourage her to act. When you first encounter Luke and his group, his care instantly turns into fear when he sees the dog bite on her arm, refusing to believe it isn't a walker bite, even though the bite marks look nothing like human teeth. If you killed the dog who attacked you quickly, rather than letting him suffer a slow death impaled on a spike, Luke assumes for some reason that this wounded 11-year-old killed a dog in cold blood, rather than in self-defense or even for mercy. The revelation that Clem could be bitten and therefore en route to zombification precisely begins the metaphorical zombification, or dehumanization, of Clementine. Where at first perhaps Luke saw the little a-racial girl that fans see, he begins instead to see a monstrous, contagious racial threat. The group proceed to partake in the same zombification of Clementine, perfectly happy to discuss shooting this 11-year-old girl in the head. This irrational racial character of perceiving her as a threat is really pronounced because she is much smaller than any of them and vastly outnumbered. So even if she were a zombie, they could defeat her really easily. They assume, not entirely wrongly, that Clem couldn't have survived on her own. So in this case, the small racialized child is also a threat because she indicates the existence of a larger racialized threat. A brown child is supposed to come with brown parents, brown neighbors, brown friends, like threatening adult Lees, Omids, and Kristas. Pete is the only one in this group of bloodthirsty adults who sees sense, advocating for Clem for like a hot second, but yeah, that doesn't last. Rest in peace, Pete. As the player controlling Clementine, you can try appealing to people's humanity by painstakingly insisting that she is just a little girl.
I'm a little girl.
You know what the hell you're doing. We got enough problems, and we don't need any new shit. Get it?
But it pretty much never works, because these people aren't seeing a child, i.e. white, innocent, worthy of protection, but a brown adult woman, i.e. contagious, threatening, marked for death. The thing is, she has to be both a child and an adult at the same time if the group is going to use her to their advantage. When understanding the adultification of racialized children, we have to understand that racialized people are viewed fundamentally as a threat, which means that being racialized is fundamentally contradictory to the idea of being a child. A child is weak, innocent, and non-threatening. A child requires care, while a racialized person is to be left for dead. So this adultification isn't about giving children the agency and power that adults have, but about marking certain children as threatening, violent, or untrustworthy to justify not only refusing to care for these children, but actively hurting them. These children are still denied agency because a racialized person cannot be a child, but a racialized person cannot also be human, where a human, as opposed to an animal or any other kind of non-human life, is deserving of political rights and freedoms, or dignity and respect and care. In this particular group, it's worth noting that there are racialized adults, like Alvin, Rebecca, and Carlos, but they aren't necessarily zombified like Clem is because they're assimilated into this smaller initial group. Interestingly, they do seem to be treated differently, in a racialized way, in Carver's prison camp, which they are forced to return to in episode 3. Carver's sexual obsession with Rebecca and insistence that he is the father of her child is disturbing. Players seem divided on the assumption that Carver and Rebecca consensually had sex or not, with some players not even considering that he may have enacted sexual violence on her, when the whole scenario invokes a sordid gendered history of black women's treatment by white men in America. And Alvin is treated by Carver as something in the way, something to be removed, so that Carver can possess Rebecca. But based on the way they treat Clem, Alvin, Rebecca, and Carlos all seem to have a real internalized racism problem as well.
Stay away from my daughter.
Willing to treat her as a villain when they have power, but turning to her for help when they are disempowered once again by Carver. As such, we see that if it might benefit the group to encourage others to see Clem as a child, they'll bank on it.
Just play it cool. You do the talking.
What? Why me?
I don't want to get in a fight. You really think he'd shoot a little girl?
but they won't see her as a child, instead consistently exploiting her emotionally and physically, while removing her from group decision-making processes and belittling her.
Clementine should stay here.
She's what?
She's just a little girl, Luke.
She's a valuable little girl. I mean, hell, if she can sew up her own arm, she's fit to cross a bridge.
And never even once thinking to ask her what she wants or needs or thinks the way that Lee used to. Never thinking to provide emotional or physical affection or care. Just literally never. Meanwhile, Sara, Clem's fellow child and character foil in this season, may also be brown, but as one assimilated into the group, she is to be shielded and protected, at least to an extent. With Sara, we see that those who are protected under the auspices of childhood might not get the same shit end of the stick as adultified Clem, but as it turns out, both ends of the stick are just shit. To be a child, as we've discussed, is to be vulnerable, powerless, and to have your agency taken from you. So it goes with Sara, who is eventually considered too burdensome by some, although I tried my damnedest to save her and I'm still not over it. I suppose there's a fine line between a child who deserves to be protected and a child who is too dependent and too burdensome to care for any longer. What good is a child if they will never become a self-reliant adult? I want to pause on this because Sara's framing as a burden is something I tried so hard to resist when playing, precisely because it plays into the sort of eugenicist discourse that communities like Crawford advocated for, that if someone is dependent on others to survive, they don't deserve to live. Of course, that's super fucking disableist. Sara is taller and looks like she could be slightly older than Clem, but she might be infantilized because of possible mental disability, which is alluded to in the season because she's prone to panic attacks and freeze responses, and she struggles to process the apocalyptic reality that she's living in. A lot of discourse surrounding Sara's life focuses on her father Carlos's responsibility for not raising her to be more self-sufficient in the apocalypse. And while there is some truth to that, I think, even if you read her as disabled, because many disabled people do advocate for the right to independent living, it's also true that some disabled people, full stop, will always need help. Sara has what are honestly perfectly normal trauma responses, but these sort of depressive responses are framed, at least by some other characters, as making her a burden. Jane tries to convince us that Sara doesn't want to live, but Sara screams for you to save her in both of her possible death states. God, I really fucking wanted to save her. And the bottom line is, even if Sara could never be self-sufficient, would she deserve to die? Absolutely fucking not. What are you saying about disabled people, children, the elderly, if you actually believe this? What are you saying about which lives are worthwhile and which aren't? Again, it's pertinent to raise that in real life, disabled people are often the first to die in disaster situations because they are unable to leave their homes without mobility aids or assistance from others. But is it really in our selfish, so-called human nature to leave our disabled family, friends, and loved ones behind? Demonstrably, it isn't. Since October 2023, I've seen Palestinian families wheeling their disabled community members, carrying newborn babies and panic-stricken animals in their arms, because these dependent lives are seen to be worth saving. Sara's death isn't some law of nature, it isn't inevitable, and you aren't some rational survivalist if you leave her to die. You're just disableist. Shifting gears from looking at Sara as an example of a disabled child, we can also see the gendered aspects of the child category explored in different ways in Season 2 and 3. In Season 3, A New Frontier, one of the main characters is Gabe Garcia, a teenager around Clem's age, who expresses feeling powerless in his group, which mainly consists of his uncle and his stepmom, later his horrible ex-military father. That sure is a theme in this series, and some other adults encountered along the way. Clem is his peer, on paper, but Clem and Gabe are also worlds apart. Gabe's emotions are often dismissed under the categorization of irrational, hormone-fueled teenage behavior, a trope which is way too normalized when it comes to justifying our treatment of children, which by and large is to continue to deny them agency and then, as they get older and more capable of pushing back, dismissing their emotional needs as irrational. You, the player, are playing as Gabe's uncle, Javi, who has some lines like this.
Look, I love these kids, but I could do without Gabe reminding me I'm not his mother whenever he's pissed.
He's a teenager. Puberty, hormones.
That are not player controlled. But as the player, you can choose to belittle Gabe or to trust and empower him. Meanwhile, Clem is pretty much treated as Javi's peer, as another adult, for better and for worse. Interestingly, Gabe articulates his frustration with his powerlessness as being a boy who wants to be a man.
I'm done feeling this way. Feeling powerless. I can't be some helpless little boy anymore. I need to be a man. Just like my dad was.
Man here is equated with power. I mean, you hear this refrain from boys often, right? Whereas you rarely hear girls saying, I'm a girl, but I want to be a woman. Who wants to be a woman when women are comparatively powerless? Gabe even recalls his father callously saying that Gabe's uncle, his own brother, Javi, is less of a man because of needing to depend on others while he was recovering from a gambling addiction and the loss of his career. The gendered aspect of this is particularly interesting because a man, of course, has power over others, something troublingly represented by Gabe's father, whose aggressive, toxic version of masculinity is one Gabe realizes he doesn't want to emulate by the end of the game. But Gabe is also afforded the privilege of being protected within his family, even if this reaches the point where he struggles to exercise his agency against Kate and Javi and later David telling him what to do. Gabe ends up making a series of insensitive comments towards Clementine.
Parents just love pretending the rest of us can't hear.
I wouldn't know.
I'll go with you, Dad.
Gabe!
He's my father, Clem. I'm sorry, but you really wouldn't understand.
How would you know that? But Clem, of course, has not had a family to protect her the way the Garcias protect each other. She hasn't particularly had that since the death of Lee or the disappearance of Krista. And no, Kenny doesn't fucking count. As with Gabe, the treatment of Clementine and later her son, AJ, can be juxtaposed starkly with the treatment of Carl and Judith Grimes, and other child characters in the Walking Dead TV show and comics. Carl and Judith are definitely in the not like other kids frame because of their maturity and strength, but as white children they are simply never ever treated with the amount of suspicion and violence that Clementine is. Their innocence and childhood are always seen as something to be protected, and instead they find themselves constantly trying to express their agency against the adults around them who want to protect their innocence. Back in Season 2, Clementine's relative powerlessness, which she experiences at the same time as being adultified and saddled with various responsibilities, is starkly demonstrated in a lot of gameplay situations where her voice is never heeded. In Episode 5, she can express this to Bonnie.
No one ever listens to me.
When, unarmed and vulnerable, she has to sneak around the group's cabin to find supplies to stitch up her own gaping wound, it reminded me of how other games convey children's powerlessness through unarmed, sneak-focused gameplay, like in Resident Evil 2. As the player, you can sometimes try to use the fact that the character you are playing is a child to your advantage through dialogue options in your approach to certain tough situations, but it rarely works. Meanwhile, the adultification of Clementine might be taken to its most troubling extreme when the main antagonist of the first 3 episodes, William Carver, essentially tries to groom her into a little cult leader like he is. Like, I really have no idea where this comes from other than the fact that she is a traumatized girl who has been forced to grow up real fast. So I feel like this must be kind of racially charged, because Carver for some reason is telling this little girl that she likes violence anytime she tries to fight back, express anger, or resist oppressive conditions. It reminds me of our earlier conversation about Lee, but it also becomes highly relevant in the final season, where Clem's son, AJ, will also become characterized as a bloodthirsty monster when all he's ever done is learn to defend himself as well as he can, and his emotions, particularly his anger, the desire to hurt people who hurt him and his loved ones, and even enjoying feeling re-empowered by these acts of self-defense after being accustomed to powerlessness his whole life, are like completely understandable emotional responses. So, like, this is just racism, right? Clem's particular racialized treatment is of course gendered as well. If Lee as an adult, and later AJ as an adultified black boy, are seen through the racial gender construct of black men as aggressive, criminal, barbaric, and threatening, Clem is certainly seen as a threat at first, but once subsumed into the group, she is exploited for empathetic labor, the labor of giving empathy, advice, emotional strength, and reliability to others. Such labor is necessary and good, of course, but exploited in some while it isn't expected from others. We find that empathetic labor is disproportionately expected from women rather than men, and particularly from racialized women. Clem finds the group, almost exclusively adults by the way, increasingly relying on her 11-year-old self for care and support, to hear their emotional confessions. In episode 2, Pete and Luke ask Clem to take care of Nick.
Would you promise me you'll watch out for Nick?
I'm worried about that kid. Keep an eye on him for me, would
Why
you?
is everyone telling me to keep an eye on Nick? Nick gets to be a kid and she has to be a grown woman? A whole-ass adult. Carlos initially tells Clem to stay away from his daughter, he knows what the D on her hat stands for, but he's soon asking Clem to take care of her too.
Clementine, can you please watch Sara?
Nick dumps his traumatic backstory on Clem instead of trying to atone for almost shooting her in the head. Clementine is forced to mediate between Kenny and Luke's groups. Sarita tells Clem about her issues with Kenny shortly after meeting her, and all of that is just episode 2. Clementine is forced to take certain roles in the prison escape plan because of her physical size, and as the game continues, Clem is saddled with responsibility for Kenny's emotional state, which descends into aggressive, violent displays of white masculinity. The group knows that Kenny is volatile, liable to verbally or physically attack people at any moment, yet Clem is constantly put in harm's way, and Kenny does both verbally and physically hurt her in these last 2 episodes. The flavor of the abuse is just slightly determinant on player choice. He even tries to weaponize her being a child against her.
You think because you're a little girl, you can just get people killed and no one will care? That because you're sorry, it'll all magically go away?
Saying she gets let off the hook because she's a little girl, which is demonstrably the opposite of what's happening. Oh, and Clementine is her own and the group's nurse, as well as Rebecca's midwife, everyone's therapist, the leader, negotiator, an escape artist, a laborer, a climber, and eventually, of course, AJ's mother. Jesus, she's just like Barbie. One stark moment which doesn't refer specifically to Clementine's race, but reveals the underpinning of the racial thinking behind the actions, particularly of white members of the group, is when you as Clem join Mike and Bonnie in the Civil War Museum in episode 4. This moment is an interesting callback to season 1, as Lee was a history professor with a particular interest in the American Civil War. Clem picks up a grey coat, handing it to Bonnie, who says it would be useful for Rebecca. Mike, a black man, sees the coat and points out that it is a Confederate coat, which would be inappropriate to give to Rebecca, a black woman. And sure enough, by the end of episode 4, we're faced with a haunting image of a cold, starving Rebecca creeping towards death in this Confederate coat, becoming zombified with her baby in her arms. Bonnie, a white woman, doesn't register this.
That's great, but isn't gray the, you know...
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry, buddy.
We can't put Rebecca in a Confederate coat.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
Of course you didn't.
Guess it's better than nothing.
Of course you didn't think about that, Bonnie. When Mike tries to apologize later, Rebecca snaps at him.
Sorry, you know, about the color.
You really think I care about that?
And this woman was advocating seriously hard for shooting Clem in the head earlier, so I don't know. I think there's some internalized racism going on. All of this is seriously underscored by its contrast to Lee's treatment of Clem in season 1, particularly in non-player controlled cutscenes. He asks her about her feelings, what she wants to do. He checks in on her mental and physical state, even if you as the player don't think to do that. Meanwhile, in season 2, adults almost never think to ask Clementine what she thinks or feels, instead telling her what to do, even dictating to her what she should want or feel or think. Not unlike Lee, it's easy to load her with responsibility, to barely let her have a say, and then blame her when anything goes wrong. To top it all off, The Walking Dead Season 2 has an ESRB rating of mature, meaning its player is likely to be at least 17 years old in Clem's 11-year-old body. With you, the player, the adultification of Clementine is complete. Trey Andrea Russworm writes of the first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead, an ending more attuned to the narrative history of dystopian blackness, perhaps one that radically and critically envisions an apocalyptic future where a black father and daughter survive together by any means necessary to fight another day, would certainly represent something we have rarely, if ever, seen in visual culture. Well, by the final season, we may not see a black father and daughter survive together, but we do get something close, a black mother and son surviving together. After Alvin and Rebecca die, she becomes the primary carer for their son, Alvin Jr., better known as AJ. In Season 3, A New Frontier, all roads lead to the common destination of Clementine alone, struggling to raise AJ. But how do we get to that point? Season 2 has 4 endings. Clementine can end up alone, or in a couple of routes she can end up with Kenny. Yeah, the guy who took up a significant part of my analysis of Season 1 because there's so much to say about how he's a huge racist. Apparently, Kenny was originally pitched as becoming the main antagonist for Season 2, discussed in the season's developer commentary. But you know what? To me, he already is the main antagonist. It's well known that to some in the Walking Dead fandom, any critique of Kenny is considered blasphemous, and this is like deeply, deeply concerning to me. Yes, Kenny is a complex character rather than a cartoon villain, which makes him compelling. But Kenny is cruel, aggressive, manipulative, violent, and point-blank abusive. The loss of his loved ones is obviously tragic, and it's hard not to recognize and feel for how deeply suicidal he becomes. But personally, my empathy for Kenny has its limit at the fact that he takes his pain out by being abusive to those around him, from Lee to, it's hinted, his partner Sarita, to even 11-year-old Clementine. Innuendo Studios' video here on YouTube, We Don't Talk About Kenny, is a great contribution to the discourse in reading Kenny's development in Season 2 into an abusive stepfather figure for Clementine. Honestly, even in Season 1 we consistently see Kenny neglect Clem. His dismissiveness of her emotional state, his drinking himself silly while Lee desperately looks for Clementine when she's missing, his initially refusing to help Lee look for her because of his personal fucking grudge. Kenny's tactics, intentional or not, clearly mimic an abuser's in multiple ways. One of these most starkly seen in Season 2 is the way he flips between a violent mode and a gentle apologetic mode, which may manipulate Clementine and or the player into staying with and supporting him, because yes, he can be violent, but he can be gentle too. He doesn't mean to hurt you. Considering Kenny's relationship with Lee and his ideological positions,
no fucking way! The invalids? What? No speaking of English?
fuck you.
You fucking commie piece of shit!
Fucking hell, Kenny. It's clear to me that Kenny isn't just an abusive stepfather figure to Clementine, but specifically a white one whose attitudes and behaviors are underpinned by racism towards her. There's actually a profound moment in Season 2 that drives this home. Walter tells Clementine,
"They say the world is over, but I'll tell you a secret. It's not. People are more political now than they ever were before."
Which, as I've argued, he's totally right about when we understand that politics is not just about formal political institutions like voting or party politics or electoral democracy, but the way that our words, behaviors, and interpersonal relationships reflect the ideologies that we've internalized, like how capitalism teaches us that selfishness is human nature when it isn't. Walker tells Kenny,
"Hey kids, what are you two talking about?"
Oh, politics.
The hell?
Well, being from Florida, I would imagine you know all about politics, Kenny.
Man, I know one advantage of living in the apocalypse is not dealing with that shit no more.
Right, so this is a guy who has never given a second thought to how he's internalized racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and how this shapes his violent, aggressive, manipulative, selfish behavior towards others. A guy who, before the apocalypse, probably never gave a thought to the suffering of houseless, black, or queer populations in Florida, as Walter's comment alludes to. And you want this guy to be Clem's stepfather figure? No fucking way. When AJ is born, Kenny regains some hope and clings to AJ as a reason to live. But are we seriously okay with Kenny, whose treatment of Lee shows us exactly what he thinks of black men, whose treatment of Clem shows us exactly how he treats brown children? I mean, are we really fucking okay with Kenny being this kid's white dad? Thank God it never happens, because if Kenny doesn't die at the end of season 2, then he dies at the beginning of season 3. Unfortunately, and I'll admit to this being one of my least favourite writing choices in the whole series, many of Kenny's possible deaths or disappearances are framed as sacrificial, heroic, and redeeming. Either he sacrificially leaves Wellington, which will only let Clem and AJ in because they're kids, or he sacrifices himself so that Clem and AJ can escape a car crash and a group of walkers. Personally, I shot him to stop him from killing Jane at the end of season 2, because fuck this guy. And fuck abusive white male characters being let off the hook with one grand sacrificial gesture. In these narratives, these characters never actually have to atone for their actions or try to change as people. They're simply absolved of responsibility in their final moments. Contrast this to the way that Lee is perceived as being redeemed from the murder of his wife's lover. If you assume that he needs to be redeemed at all, which I've said I don't agree with, but let's just take that for granted for a second, through consistent kindness, care, empathy, and trustworthiness displayed towards others throughout the season, this is how Lee is redeemed. Not through some grand symbolic gesture right at the end. I guess we have a double standard for holding black and white men accountable, right? Kenny is directly implicated in Clementine's groups failing in both the first and second seasons, and I don't think redemption should be this easy for him, or anyone who's done all of the shitty fucking things he's done. The other person Clementine can end up with is Jane, the lone wolf who keeps insisting she's better off alone, pushing people away because she's too afraid to lose them. Fascinatingly, this is sort of Clem's own character arc in A New Frontier. She becomes a lone wolf like Jane and hesitant to trust like Jane. If you do end up with Jane at the beginning of season 3, she takes her own life after learning she's pregnant with Luke's baby, which is horribly bleak and, in my view, not as egregious as the Kenny endings, but still a deeply unsatisfying ending for Jane's story. I don't know, maybe better delivery could have made this work for me, but fundamentally, if Kenny's redemption would have needed to be more convincing than a two-dimensional sacrificial gesture, I would have liked to see Jane beginning to open up to trusting Clem and others, rather than taking her own life within 5 seconds of her first appearance because they just needed some way to remove her from the story. Or maybe she could have disappeared, never to be seen again, like Krista. I mean, to this day I'm still sad that we never saw Krista again, but Jane would have deserved a disappearance like that more than the deaths she got. Ultimately, it's Jane's desperation not to be alone, which she vehemently denies on the surface, that leads her to taking the extreme act of hiding AJ so that Kenny believes he's dead and tries to kill her in order to prove to Clementine who Kenny really is and convince her to leave him together. I mean, I really did not need convincing of that, so this move had the opposite effect. But I still maintain that the threat of Jane abandoning Clem and AJ is not equivalent to the threat of Kenny verbally abusing or physically assaulting them. Marlianne Ruckamkill Butt and Daniel Dunn write about this final decision, to shoot Kenny or to let him kill Jane, arguing that Clementine is forced to choose between her individuality, represented by Jane, and the good of the community, represented by Kenny. True enough that, as they put it, Jane teaches Clementine many of the skills needed for survival in this world, whereas Kenny attempts to protect Clementine but neglects to teach her how to survive independently, and essentially forces the reliance of living on a patriarchal figure. Well, not sure how much he even protects her, in my opinion, but I do agree. We talked about these different parenting styles earlier and about how Lee strikes a balance between care and empowerment, rather than paternalistic protection, represented in all its horror by Kenny, or emotional instability and abandonment, represented by Jane. The thing is, I have a lot of empathy for Jane, but I don't think her parenting style is all that great either, particularly because she has a habit of telling Clementine every chance she gets, really, that she really doesn't want to be a parent. In a sense, Kenny and Jane represent different forms or different versions of capitalist individualism and how it can make you a bad parent. Not a bad person, but a bad parent. Regarding the final choice, but and done right, one choice is presented as more naturalistic than the other. Jane's death appears incidental, since what causes her death is for the player character of Clementine to not act and let the game, and thus Kenny, run its course into the death of Jane. Choosing to do nothing, to not select an option but let the timer run out, also causes the death of Jane and thus presents her death as fated through the very game mechanics. Referring to the trolley problem, the lack of action suggests that Clementine and the player is absolved of guilt for not intervening, since it could be seen that the natural sequence of events was for Jane to die. I'm a bit ambivalent about this reading personally. My own reading of this moment is that, in an instance of violence, Kenny is about to murder Jane, your inaction is also a kind of violence. If you let him do it when you could have stopped it, it's as good as killing Jane yourself. Or maybe not as good as it, but pretty bad. No matter how I felt about Jane in this moment, I couldn't do nothing. It's also worth considering that if you do kill Kenny, when Jane tries to beg your forgiveness and insists that she did this for you, if you remain silent, the result is that Clementine goes with Jane, but silently. I actually sort of assumed that silence would lead to Clementine going alone, because all roads seem to point that way, but silence seems to indicate that even after all that, Jane and Clem are still better together than otherwise. At least, that's what I had hoped, until season 3, as I mentioned, which refuses to let Jane change before killing her off. It's interesting to note that Jane is the main female adult role model that Clementine has throughout the first 2 seasons. In season 1, Lily is a wreck, and of course she lets her racist dad off the hook for everything he does. Katja is nice, but more focused on her son than on Clem, and is a bit of a pushover when her husband Kenny gets in a rage, and then of course she dies. Carly was mom material because she cared about Clem, supported Lee, and took no shit, but sadly she doesn't last very long, and I'm still not over it. In season 2, Krista is there, initially keen to take care of Clementine, but becoming jaded by the loss of her husband and baby. I really would have liked to see more of Krista, particularly because this would have given Clementine a black mother figure, and it would have been really compelling to see the two try against all odds to find each other again, and to hopefully become united rather than separated by their shared grief. But alas, Krista disappears, never to return. Bonnie and Sarita are characterized by their devotion or subjugation to violent, dysfunctional men over the season.
I can manage, Ken.
I said I got it.
Always has to play the gentleman.
Sarita claiming she thought she could save Kenny.
That's not the Kenny I know in there. I thought...
Oh, Sarita. Bonnie complaining about men, but somehow always supporting their shitty actions.
You know, I've been all over. Run with a lot of people. A lot of men. And listened to a lot of promises. Ain't one of them come true. I'm starting to think there might be another way, you know?
No!
Clem!
Bonnie, we have to go.
Don't you touch me. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen.
Classic fucking Bonnie. Then trying to be friendly with Clementine to assuage her guilt. Bonnie's vibes are really just white woman as hell in the way she upholds the violent status quo for her own comfort.
He keeps things in line. He's got a lot of this stuff figured out. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to be somewhere comfortable for a while.
and then, feeling guilty because she knows on some level that what she's doing is wrong, tries to come across as the good guy. Rebecca is a huge fucking dick to Clem at first. Literally, she's the most passionate advocate for putting a bullet in Clementine's 11-year-old head. Then Rebecca becomes completely dependent on Clem, and then she dies and passes the torch of motherhood into Clementine's tiny hands. All of this, at least, is something which Jane can't be held responsible for. Jane pays attention to Clem, teaches her survival skills, and cares about her, albeit dysfunctionally. Her care is probably more physical and practical than emotional, because it definitely fucks with your head to hear her constantly talking about how she wants to abandon you. Jane's fear of intimacy means you can never really trust she'll offer stable parenting, especially because she won't stop talking about how much she doesn't want children. And women have every right not to want to give birth or to have children, but it's really important to question the liberal feminist paradigm of a woman's right to choose here, because, in the nicest way possible, sometimes the greater good is more important than what you want. The right thing to do is care for these kids who fucking need it, whether Jane wants to or not. As a result, Jane sort of ends up representing a choice-based, individualist, neoliberal feminism. The supreme good is her individual right to choose, even if this fucks other people over, and she believes she doesn't owe anyone anything, which the game actually allowed me to respond to in almost exactly the way I wanted.
Listen, when the shit hits the fan, because it always does, remember that you can make it on your own. It's not an option for everyone. If things start heading south, don't let them drag you down with them.
For God's sake, Jane.
You don't owe them anything.
Yes, I do.
They'll make you feel like you do. Like it's all one happy family. When push comes to shove.
I owe these people everything. They've kept me safe, looked out for me. I wouldn't be here without them.
Well, they can't keep you safe forever.
No one is safe forever.
So, Kenny is a shit white patriarchal father figure, and Jane is a shit white liberal feminist mother figure. Ultimately, the surrogate white parents modelled by both Kenny and Jane are no good. All endings lead to Clementine alone, whether at the end of Season 2 or at the beginning of Season 3. Just her and AJ. And so, Clem becomes a single mother at the ripe old age of 11. She does a pretty fantastic job in the circumstances, but no one can really be a parent alone, so Clem turns to a group, the New Frontier, for help. But then, despite their resources, the New Frontier refuses to give AJ the medicine he needs when he gets sick, because they say it would be a waste of resources that could be used for someone who contributes. Clem is discovered sneaking into a New Frontier camp to secretly medicate AJ, or about to do so but changing her mind at the last minute, depending on what you as the player choose. Either way, she's caught and assumed to have stolen from the New Frontier, who kick her out as a result. Clem is derided and villainized, both made out to be a traitor to the community for doing what they won't, looking after this child, and made out to be an unfit mother, as they forcibly separate her from AJ. If the New Frontier think AJ is a waste of resources, it doesn't even make sense that they would take him away from Clem. It's just cruel. Again, as with the foster system and state institutionalization of family separations, we see a racialized mother separated from her child on the faulty premise of her unfitness as a mother. What's really happening is that Clem, like other racialized and working class mothers, is being blamed for her circumstances of being houseless, poor, and alone, which the New Frontier could help with just as readily as our governments could help single teenage mothers by offering them welfare and housing instead of separating them from their children. This theme of Clementine's supposed unfitness as a mother carries to Season 4, the final season, where certain characters repeatedly question her parenting decisions or blame her for the things that they don't like or understand about AJ. After spending a lot of time on the road, Clem and AJ are caught in a car crash near Erickson's boarding school for troubled youth, where, after the zombie apocalypse, the majority of adults abandoned the students to fend for themselves. The surviving kids, now up to the age of around 18 or 19, turn Erickson into their home, and they take Clem and AJ in after the car accident. Tensions are high at first, though definitely less so compared to how adults have behaved in previous seasons, but they warm up to each other quite quickly, with the group feeding them, housing them, playing games, and getting to know them. Mind, these kids have less resources than adult-run settlements like the New Frontier, and they're still happy to share. Clem and AJ are hopeful that this could be a home for them, but there's one big problem. From some of the group's perspective, that problem is AJ, and Clem too, for the way she parents him. At the end of the first episode, Clem discovers that Marlon, the leader of Erickson, secretly traded Erickson students to a nearby group of raiders from a place called the Delta in exchange for the precarious promise of safety. The kidnapped students are taken to be groomed into child soldiers, and Marlon draws an ever-dwindling so-called safe zone, which is really a border between Erickson and Delta land. Secretly, he decides that if the Delta Raiders will return, he'll give up Clem and AJ to them, and when Clem overhears him discussing this with Brody, the only other person that knows about it, he kills Brody with his bare hands, then blames Clementine for it, waving a gun around at everyone and spouting anti-migrant, racist rhetoric.
We saved their lives when anyone else would have kept walking! We fed them, we kept them warm, and this is how they thank us!
AJ, now a 5-year-old black boy, points a gun right back at Marlon, ready to defend his mother and, crucially, the others whom Marlon could possibly hurt. Clem tries to convince the group of the truth and appeals to either Violet or Lewis for help. My first choice was to appeal to Violet because she seemed dependable and sympathetic to AJ, while Lewis seemed irresponsible and emotionally avoidant. Then, after Marlon surrenders, AJ shoots him in the head. Poor AJ is only a kid, much younger than many of the others here, born into this apocalyptic world and trying his best to learn how to navigate it. Marlon was threatening Clementine and the others, so he shot him because this is how he understands the world, mostly having had to deal with walkers rather than humans at this point. You, as Clem, AJ's mother, basically have to try to teach him lessons about when violence is and isn't justifiable, how to make amends when you've done wrong, how people do bad things but aren't bad people, all that fun stuff. It isn't fucking easy, and if people don't like what AJ says or does, Clem is identified as the problem, rather than the horrible circumstances these two have to survive in. What makes it harder is the way AJ is adultified, characterized through racial tropes of black men. He's seen by some of the group not as a kid who made a mistake, albeit a very grave one, but as a so-called psycho, a lunatic, and a murderer. In other words, AJ, who, I cannot stress this enough, is 5 years old, is the violent, threatening, barbaric, and criminal black man in some eyes. What's more, Clem is held responsible.
What the fuck did you teach this kid?
Hey! Because violent, criminal black men are, of course, raised by bad, unfit mothers. This made me particularly angry coming from Lewis, who, sort of like Bonnie back in season 2, insists on kicking AJ and Clem out and trying to take away their means of protection. Utterly fucking clueless and having lived a comparatively sheltered life, he consistently characterizes AJ as a dangerous little monster. Then he turns around and tries to be the nice guy while perpetuating all of that, because he feels guilty but doesn't want to acknowledge that he made a mistake. There's sort of an apology later, but I can't say I personally ever forgave Lewis for that, even if he was hurting over losing his best friend, Marlon. The only people who don't see AJ this way at any point are Ten, who is literally the sweetest boy on earth, and also a young black boy, which feels significant. Asim, a no-nonsense, sensible king, also a teenage boy of color, again feels significant, and the white girl of the month, Violet, who, having stood between AJ and her own friends with a meat cleaver, proves herself real solid white teen mother material. The way this season mirrors but also does something different with the Lee and Clementine dynamic that we got back in season 1 is just so fucking good. AJ is born into this world and Clem starts teaching him all about violent self-defense much sooner, probably because she's afraid of what will happen to him if she dies, which she talks about quite a bit.
Okay, what are you thinking about right now?
You getting bit. Turning into a monster.
Oh.
Yeah. The older I get, the more I see it. I don't know why. What happens then? Anyone can get bit. Doesn't matter if you're inside or outside or how careful you are. It does something weird to my stomach. Like I'm gonna get the dookies.
AJ, I need to know you remember what we talked about. What you're supposed to do if it happens. Listen to me. If I get bit, you'll... shoot.
No. No, I'm not gonna do that.
AJ, you promised.
I don't care. I'm not gonna shoot you. If you get bit, I'd want you to bite me too.
What? You don't mean that.
I want to be alone. Please don't be mad. I can't live with you not with me, Clem. I know we've talked about it so much, but don't make me.
And indeed, she almost does die, which was not pretty for me on stream. So this 5-year-old is just as capable as Clem was by the end of season 2 at half the age. Also, he's a boy, which means when some people see him with a gun, the adult black male trope is forced on him already. But unlike Clem, no particular demand of empathetic, domestic, or caring labor is expected of AJ. Unlike Clem, he has a mother to look after him. And at her still young age, it's still Clementine's responsibility as his mother to teach him to navigate social situations and group dynamics that are now completely new to him, because the two of them have been alone for most of his life. Even though the game invokes the parallels between Lee and Clementine and AJ, something has shifted, partly due to a reversal of the dadification of games, which is worthy of note in itself. We aren't a man protecting a little girl anymore, but a teenage girl protecting a little boy. And partly due to technological developments in the near decade since the development of the first game, which allow Clem and AJ's relationship to be more narratively and mechanically complex. The effect is that this also renders the complexity of there being both mother and son, and also two really fucking traumatized children left to fend for themselves in an apocalyptic world. A big theme in AJ's character arc is his growing unease at feeling powerless, or at not being perceived as a trusted peer. Very natural for all growing children, but 5-year-old AJ is growing up particularly fast in a particularly harsh environment. He expresses repeatedly that he wants to protect Clem too, that he doesn't want her to do all the work. Your final major decision in the whole series is to trust AJ with the hard choices or to tell him he isn't ready. You make this decision after AJ confronts you with all the decisions that you've made for Clem so far, and how they've confused him or how they've made him feel. And he insists in this final episode that it's time to stop listening to Clem unquestioningly. In season 1, Clem almost always listens to Lee. This is all so new to her, the world has only just changed, and Lee, as an adult, probably gives more of an impression that he knows what he's doing, but he's also struggling as he goes along. But AJ tells Clem, and the player, that she's not always going to be right, and that she's confused too, which could be true of any person, like it was for Lee, but in Clem's case, as AJ points out, she is also just a child. If you choose not to trust AJ, the game straight up tells you that it was the wrong choice.
When we were in the barn, you didn't listen to me. And if you had, I'd be dead. I shouldn't have said you weren't ready. Back in the cave, you showed me how wrong I was.
If AJ is trusted to make the tough calls, he heartbreakingly decides to shoot his own friend, 10. But if you don't trust him, he nervously watches as Lewis is eaten by zombies. Yeah, it's always Lewis. I don't know what you're talking about. Never happens to Violet, because if she died in that moment after everything I'd been through with her, I don't think I would have recovered. Remember how earlier I said that Lee's tragic fate was narratively sealed through the parallel images at the start and end of the first season? How the old world values were dictating how people acted in the new world, and perhaps it was too soon for a black man to escape that and survive with his daughter? Almost 10 years later, Clem is bitten and accepts that this is the end for her, but fights with every last laboured breath she has to get AJ to safety. In contrast to Season 1, where you control Lee guiding Clem to the very end, here you actually switch between Clem and AJ, beautifully representing how Clem is now struggling to act alone. In a grim parallel to the end of the first season, Clementine sits, the colour draining from her face, and tells AJ that this is it. Either he has to shoot her or leave her behind. AJ lifts an axe above his head and the camera cuts to black. After one final sequence as Clem, flashing back to the events that occurred between Season 3 and 4, we then play as AJ in the final moments of the game, spearfishing near Erickson. When he goes home, to my complete shock and then delight, I have never cried so ugly on stream as when I thought Clementine was dead. There is Clem, alive and kicking, albeit with 1.5 legs. The cycle is broken. A black mother and son survive together. I've talked about how a lot of the zombie genre is riddled with misanthropy and libertarianism. Humans can't be trusted and there's no hope for a better world. All you can do is protect you and your property, be that your family, who you own, or the house and land that you claim to own, as if anyone can own people or the earth. In The Walking Dead TV series and comics, this theme is approached with a hopeful outlook towards finding and building communities. We're heavy-handedly told that everyone is family now, though when push comes to shove, the importance of the nuclear family persists, and that gated communities like Alexandria are our hope for the future, because they represent what we had before. And there's the issue, or one of many issues. The main story, thematically consistent, at least for one that centers around a white cop, is obsessed with going back. No lessons are learned about the fundamental structural violence of the old world. Any reference to how the cast never would have met before the zombie apocalypse because of their class and racial differences is only surface, with no meaningful critique of the institutions that create race and class difference in the first place, like the settler US government and the racist police. A wistful longing for the time before almost always indicates that someone lived in a position of relative privilege. Access to food, housing, citizenship, and other protections, never considering how the time before was as, if not more violent for the marginalized, oppressed classes of society, both within the imperial core and across the world. There are a few, mostly optional lines longing for this world before in the Telltale series as well. At times, I'm limited to being able to express agreement as the only form of hope, or complete cynicism, saying that we're doomed. Other times we can express or hear that the world before was pretty shitty too.
Don't you want to go back to the moment before you knew about all of this?
No.
Things were bad before. Bad now, but they're different, you see?
People are eating each other.
But they weren't before. The banks, the politics, the crap. Those things are gone. Hell comes in a lot of different colors.
Comrade Lee!
I don't remember a time before monsters.
You know what, little dude? It's okay that you don't. Believe me, the world before this one was pretty shitty.
Weirdly, one of these lines comes from Lewis, who is like the most privileged character you meet in the whole series, but whatever, I guess. There are other fraught renderings of the world before, particularly in the final season. A non-optional moment worth an eyebrow raise is when Ten and AJ fight over a toy figure of a cop, and Ten explains that cops used to protect us. You as the player have no option to reject or disagree with the statement. Later, depending on your choices, AJ might say he wants to be like another policeman or firefighter, and once again you don't have any opportunity to challenge this. But he does equate being a cop to killing, specifically being able to tell the good from the bad and knowing who deserves to be killed and who doesn't.
I know you want to be big for everyone, but you're just a kid. Like me. Sometimes you're scared, just like any other kid. So I'll help. You said all the policemen and firefighters died. So I'm gonna be a new one. Even if I don't get it just right, I am. Because all it means is killing bad people who hurt other people. And I'm good at that. Like, I think I could be the best at killing bad people. Better than you even. Because I wouldn't hesitate.
AJ, that's not the future I want for you. I love you too much, and I see you slipping away. Getting more violent, more angry, more lost.
You shouldn't be afraid of that. I won't let it happen. I need you to trust me, Clem. That I can tell the good people and the bad people apart. That I know when to use my gun. And that you'll let me decide for my own.
As I talked about earlier, that's literally beat for beat the propaganda that justifies police violence. This moment in particular, and a few of these other contentious mentions of the old world, feel so strange considering so much of the series' content. And not just the first season, which I've gone over a lot, but various other moments in the series which open space for critique of the police, military-industrial, and prison-industrial complex. From the pathetic, mindlessly violent cops in the prison van in 400 Days, to the villainous Carver and his settlement, a hardware store turned prison camp where inmates are trapped by armed guards with a penchant for hitting children and forced into labor, to nuclear family-obsessed ex-military David, who says things like,
"Soldier isn't a husband. Or a father. A soldier is a soldier. Nothing else."
implying that soldiers themselves might be zombies as mindless killing machines, a theme synthesized at last through the racist, violent Larry being an ex-military man, using military logic to create a state of exception in which any asshole action he takes goes. And this guy raises his daughter Lily, the army brat, to be the main antagonist of the final season, a woman who kidnaps, blackmails, maims, and forces children into being soldiers for her personal army. Of course, I've mentioned my critiques around writing characters like Sara and Kenny, and this is another area where I'm not the biggest fan of how it's approached. Mostly from a gameplay perspective, right? It's the fact that I have little ability to challenge or express opposition to these viewpoints other than that one Comrade Lee moment from Season 1. But perhaps, to be fair, this should be viewed through the lens of playing Clementine as a character. Sean Vanneman and Jake Rodkin talked about how in Season 1 they designed dialogue choices not to give players the options to say whatever they want, but to say one of a few things that Lee as a character might feasibly do or say, depending on what kind of day he was having. Though I don't necessarily think that this is a closed circle because our dialogue selections can influence our interpretations of Lee as a character. Does he have an aggressive dark side which led him to the crime of passion which he was arrested for? That's perhaps a troubling reading which encourages us to interpret Lee through that racist prism of the aggressive criminal black man. Is Lee a sheltered middle-class academic who spouts Marx in theory but not in practice, or simply a naive liberal assimilationist? What was his background before he was an academic? These are questions that our very act of dialogue selection might lead us to fill in our imagination in different ways. When it comes to playing as Clem, she was really young when this whole zombie apocalypse thing started, and her parents were middle-class black and brown people, a doctor and an engineer. Maybe they had liberal sensibilities, would have voted for Obama and Kamala if they'd lived too, because a black or a brown face on a genocidal state is something to celebrate. They did ask Clem to call the police when everything went down. Maybe they didn't teach her to fear the police, which they naively believed were there to protect them and not capital. She never lived long enough in that old world to see the day a police officer would stare at her down the barrel of a gun, like a zombie. In Season 1, Clementine often wonders if things will go back to the way they were before.
Do you think things will ever be normal again? Just like the way they were before?
And this wish should be seen as specific to her circumstances. Her life was largely comfortable before, and she probably didn't understand why other people didn't have it that way, or might not have even considered that other people didn't have it that way at all. So why wouldn't she wish for that? Of course, Civil War professor and comrade Lee might have taught Clementine something like this.
People are eating each other.
But they weren't before. The banks, the politics, the crap.
But we'll never know. So, most likely, no one was around to teach her about the evils of the old world, which makes sense considering that, as far as we can tell, she lived a fairly idyllic suburban childhood. You know, she had a treehouse and a pool in her backyard, her parents hired a long-term babysitter while they went on holiday, and Clementine was none the wiser that people were suffering on the other side of the white picket fence, the border, the ocean, to guarantee that comfort. Sure, maybe crazy guys attacked her dad sometimes, but some people are just crazy, right? Before the zombie apocalypse, Clementine might not have known, not as well as a kid like Violet might have. You know, a kid who grew up in a trailer, whose dad drank himself into absence, whose grandma sat next to her one day and killed herself, whose mom couldn't hire a babysitter and, with a deadbeat husband and no one else to help her, tired from working 3 jobs, sent her child to a boarding school for troubled youth. We never really get to ask Violet these questions, but I wonder how she would answer them. Does she long for the old world? It seems unlikely, while Clementine and Louis easily dream up a mansion with a treehouse for their future home, an amalgamation of the material privileges that they had before. Violet tells us that she can't imagine her ideal home.
I remember how Marlon described it, and what we were going to turn Erickson into. It's not the way any of us pictured it. How did you picture it? I guess I couldn't. I just listened to what Marlon said. How it would be a home. A real one, but I couldn't really wrap my head around it. My family lived in a trailer.
Well, that actually makes me more interested in her dreams. By the end of the 2nd season of The Walking Dead, things are looking bleak. No one can be trusted, those you can trust die, no good deed goes unpunished, every community you meet is either a eugenicist, fascist, militaristic cult, or a dysfunctional family hanging by an absolute thread. Why do these groups and communities fail? Almost consistently because of building what they have based on the ideologies of the old world. Carver's settlement is a prison camp.
You mean my first night in prison?
It ain't a prison. More of a...
It's a prison, Bonnie.
Don't they do those in prisons?
And the prisoners revolt. Crawford is a eugenicist hellhole, where burdens like children, the elderly, and the disabled are discarded. And it is precisely a pregnant woman who doesn't want to be forced into abortion that causes Crawford to collapse when she kills a doctor within airtight fascist walls, and the resulting zombie outbreak turns everyone. And this is just it, right? We are the Walking Dead. The threat isn't them, it's us. And walls can't protect us from us. In Season 3, the New Frontier is a colonial group which destroys and steals from other settlements, or else takes over them and their production. And by Season 4, the Delta Raiders, led by I'm not racist but Lily, falls apart because the people they try to recruit as child soldiers decide to fight back. Like Crawford, like Carver's camp, and like the New Frontier, their own way of doing things leads to revolt from within, and therefore their own destruction. A lot of zombie games reify the lone cowboy type. They avoid the communities they encounter because they all suck, so they go it alone, like Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us, or Deacon and Boozer in Days Gone. This is all part of a trend of what we might call Western survivalist fantasies, texts which encourage comfortable Western audiences to imagine living in dire circumstances, particularly to imagine themselves as heroic or uniquely capable of survival or uniquely moral compared to others, while erasing the fact that others live in the very circumstances of poverty, houselessness, and violent occupation or proxy wars or natural disasters exacerbated by imperialist greed. Of course, these cowboys, usually men, are family-oriented, embodying the colonial masculinity of the cowboy, the individual freedom of the libertarian capitalist. But Telltale's The Walking Dead tells us that neither the reification of the nuclear family nor going it alone are viable solutions. People who think they can make it on their own can't. Jane tries to hide it, but it's her crushing loneliness that leads her to take extreme action at the end of season 2. And if Clem walks away, she says out loud,
I can't do this alone. Okay? Is that what you want to hear? Clem?
In season 3, Clem turns to the new frontier because raising a baby alone is too much, and in season 4 she finds a home where both AJ and she can finally be taken care of. And just at the time that she becomes physically disabled, admitting to AJ,
If it was just you and me alone out there, and I was like this, I don't know if I'd make it 2 weeks.
It's a poetic synthesis of the series' anti-eugenicist themes. Clementine herself becomes disabled but continues to be a valued and protected part of the group, as do Louis or Violet, determinant on your choices, but none are characterized by disablest tropes as being burdens or being discarded by the group, or even, on the flip side, as being superpowered savants or athletes. They're going to need help now, and that's okay. The group is going to have to make adjustments for them, and that's okay. This is what makes Erickson different. It's a school for troubled youth. This group isn't just children who are already an oppressed and socially marginalized class in the old world, or our world, having little to no legal rights or autonomy within our social structures, but specifically children who are perceived as being deviant in some way, in need of correction, hence shipped off to a boarding school, a prison of its own. The group includes poor, queer, or mentally distressed kids for the most part, that the school would have worked to shape into normative adults, as we can particularly gauge from the use of psych evaluations and probationary reports for each of these children. And, I guess Louis is there? Because he was a rich, spoiled child who calculatedly plotted his parents' divorce because his dad wouldn't let him have singing lessons, which explains why he looks like a Victorian ghost in the original sketches anyway. I mean, I guess he's probably troubled, but not really marginalized. He is a kid anyway. Right, so Erickson is different, or at least it has the potential to become something different. A place where these kids can build a home and make new rules.
Back then, there were all kinds of rules. About who was innocent, who was guilty. It was complicated.
We have to decide things for ourselves now. We can't rely on other people to make the rules for us.
And make the world better than it was before.
I think walkers won't always be around. They'll go away someday. 'Cause the world goes in cycles, right? Ice Age, Stone Age, some other ages. So it's like that. This age will end, and another one will start.
An age without walkers, like it used to be.
It'll be better.
The school in general is a site of struggle, particularly secondary schools, middle schools, high schools, where kids are getting older and more desperate, understandably, to exercise their agency, while school institutions work to repress those instincts and to discipline and punish children. The kids mention a few times that they don't want to run things the way adults do, with some of the graffiti around the school declaring that it's their world now and they make the rules. This hasn't always gone well. We gauge from the more troubling graffiti about the weak dying and the strong surviving, as well as Marlon's short-sighted leadership, the group's unsustainable way of doing things, like cordoning off the greenhouse and relying purely on fish and game to survive. But what will become clear is that this needs to mean rejecting the values of selfishness, capitalist individualism, libertarianism, and militarism associated with the world the adults built and ran, which the kids were powerless in. One of the positive qualities from the go is that while the school conveniently has a gate and a wall, because it was a prison that they couldn't leave, no one is militaristically defending their borders or refusing people at the gate. Sure, they're a bit skeptical of Clem and AJ at first, but when they need help, they're pretty happy to take them in. Marlon spins the eugenicist mouths to feed rhetoric on its head.
You and AJ are 2 more mouths to feed. Maybe help me feed the rest.
With slight variations on things like who survives your playthrough and the renaming of the school, representing the end of Erickson, the man who founded the school and everything he stood for, the game ends with the group spotting a caravan nearby and discussing wanting to make contact with them. Specifically, they're on their guard but cautiously optimistic, hoping they'll be open to trade and wanting to approach the group in a friendly, cooperative manner. This is a stark contrast to The Walking Dead TV show and comics, which more or less promote a military and police-run, thoroughly militarized, walled community as the solution to their problems, insisting that they have remade the old fascist world, but it's better now because they have some gay people and some brown people there, which the writers have killed off and replaced with new ones at a rate just slow enough that you might not notice. Encounters with new groups are occasionally good but usually bad, leaving the series on a much less hopeful note than the Telltale one. Robert Yates points out in his analysis of the Walking Dead TV show and comics that this resembles contemporary gated communities, both on a small scale in the suburbs of American cities and in the broader sense resembling Fortress America, which maintains comfort and luxuries on the inside at the expense of everyone outside, usually the unsavory racialized and working classes of increasingly gentrified urban neighborhoods, or the impoverished people of the global south under the boot of American imperialism, in order to maintain middle-class suburban American standards of living. Rick's group are in a state of exception because of the zombie threat, therefore they're justified in turning Alexandria into a militarized mini-state. This resembles securitization of the state, which I talked about before, and the narrative that the threat of terrorism justifies the increased hypermilitarization and policing of the US settler colony. In fact, Yates compares the ideal of the TV show and comics to its critique in the video game, pointing out Crawford is a well-guarded militaristic community which has leaned too far towards a form of violent, oppressive governance, as is revealed in a series of videotapes the player can discover. However, this gated community's perverse and extreme defensiveness was also its critical weakness. The communities we encounter before Erickson, which I'm now going to call Texas 2 because that's what I renamed it in my playthrough, unsurprisingly have carceral and punitive structures too, justifying punishment and violence towards outside groups on the basis of resource restriction. But what we see in practice is that groups like the New Frontier hoard supplies in order to create a comfortable standard of living, so much so that they live in houses and eat creamed spinach and Black Forest gâteau instead of living off scraps the way so many others are. Then they deny these poor houseless others into their community on the basis that they supposedly don't have enough to go around, but they have plenty to go around. And of course, the idea that this punishment would de-incentivize people to steal is pure bullshit. If someone is starving and their only choice is stealing, they're going to steal, and they're justified in doing it. The answer isn't to punish, but to address the material condition of poverty. Ultimately, this very exploitation and violent carceral behavior from the New Frontier to Carver's Camp to the Delta Raiders leaves the exploited groups, survivors from Prescott, the prison laborers, and the prospective child soldiers, to revolt, and violent resistance is justified and necessary in order to break the violent structures that oppress them. Attempts at negotiations with all three groups, any attempts at trusting in or believing in their structures, laws, or rules, are consistently and rightly revealed to be futile, even foolish. Stealing from and exploiting others is given the justification that these groups need to survive the long winter, but the violent punishment or exile of thieves, for example, doesn't help them survive, it helps them enjoy a better standard of living at the expense of others. There's actually a pretty great episode of The Walking Dead TV series that illustrates this by jump cutting between cheerily soundtracked clips of a character making a delicious breakfast sandwich with images of the violence and exploitation that his group, the Saviors, commit in order to guarantee the comfortable standard of living that he has. The same is alluded to with the Delta Raiders in the game's final season. When Lily tells Clementine the parable of the twins, she talks about how the community has walls, solar panels, hot water, raises pigs and grows corn, painting it as a place of luxury and comfort. She explains how Minnie was brainwashed by the group and its comforts, while her twin sister Sophie refused to be fooled, recognizing and rejecting the violence it's built on. The torture, the systematic kidnapping and grooming of children into child soldiers, the perpetual war with outside communities. Clementine agrees with Sophie, saying to Abel, one of the raiders,
"What kind of place is this Delta if they use forced labor to defend it?"
In other words, oppressors maintain the comfort that they have through systematized violence, and if comfort is afforded to a few at such a great cost, it isn't fucking worth it. Sometimes the raiders try to find common ground by equating their urge to protect their home with Clementine and the other kids. But this is a false equivalence. The Delta Raiders have power and resources and enact systematized violence to maintain their status quo. Clementine and the other kids are forced to engage in violence to defend their home and resist being forced into labor and the military. In other words, if Clementine's group doesn't fight, they'll die. If the Delta stop fighting, the violence will stop. And yes, I do think this logic should be applied to other contexts, for example, Palestine and Israel, with Palestinians being Clementine's group, who notably also use guerrilla warfare, and the Delta being Israel, a colonial oppressor. The Delta's excuse is some sort of vaguely referred to war in the north with other raiders, but I don't know, it's sounding a lot like colonial propaganda to me, you know? We don't have any reason to believe them, and even if we did, what they're doing still wouldn't be justified, and it isn't comparable at all to what Clementine and the others are doing. The group at Texas 2 goes from having a leader, Marlon, that secretly made the decision to trade some of the kids with the Delta Raiders, to approaching problems through voting and collective decision-making. After AJ kills Marlon, the group votes on whether or not to let them stay. Not everyone is happy with the decision to kick Clem and AJ out at first, but the group works through the conflict to make the decision as a collective. And then they also kind of realize it was the wrong decision, and they take Clementine and AJ back when they need the help. When you've played the first 2 seasons of really fucking dysfunctional decision-making and group dynamics by selfish, depraved adults, these kids are of course not perfect, but they're a fucking breath of fresh air. Being with these kids also teaches Clem and AJ that they can't rely on only each other. Marlon says that maybe they could do with a break from each other, and indeed, as beautiful as this relationship is, Clem and AJ's hyper-reliance on one another and only one another creates a certain amount of dysfunction in and of itself. The entire burden of protecting and teaching AJ is Clem's, when Clem is a child herself and confused. No one's perfect, and she isn't always right. The final episode, which flits between Clementine and AJ's perspectives, emphasizes this. So does that gameplay decision I talked about earlier with regards to the first season. You as the player are making decisions on Clementine's behalf, and you never feel like you're making the right choice. Equally, as much as Clem doesn't want AJ to grow up too fast, it's inevitable, and he is. Earlier I talked about how a lack of control in Season 1 and 2 reflect Lee and Clementine's racialized positions. In Season 4, Clementine is surrounded by peers, and this group of peers is threatened by a force comprised of adults that want to subordinate and exploit them. AJ, as Clem's dependent, is a character we have some but little control over. Clementine can instruct AJ what to do at times, but he can resist or disagree with these commands, expressing his own agency. A lot of this is in response to player input, the actions you have taken that are not direct instructions to AJ but which AJ internalizes and responds to, the way children learn from what they see perhaps more than what they're told. AJ increasingly wants to express his agency, and particularly in the final episode, as I mentioned before, if you choose not to trust him to make the hard calls, he and the game tell you that you're wrong. Further, gameplay sequences where Clementine attempts to do something and can't, so the player begins to control AJ, and together they can accomplish these things, emphasizes that Clementine needs help too, and AJ can be trusted to give it. Like any parent, Clem needs to begin to see AJ as her equal and to trust him, both for his sake and for her own. In turn, Clem and AJ encourage the group at Texas 2 to rethink their way of doing things, particularly rejecting Marlon's approach and encouraging everyone to see that you can't negotiate with an oppressor, in this case the Delta, and any safety or peace that's obtained through such negotiation is not safe in the long run. They will come for you eventually. Clem and AJ encourage the kids to fight, and eventually they defeat this force, dissolving the borders of the so-called safe zone, not only rejecting this border system, but rejecting its faulty premise that borders ensure safety. And this final season approaches the theme of violence in nuanced ways, which comes to a head with the character of James, whose pacifist ideology of never hurting humans or walkers results in an aggressive outburst if he survives. James, like the New Frontier before him, attempts to separate Clem and AJ, insisting that Clem clearly can't raise AJ right, but he, James, can. Like, he says this as he is physically attacking and threatening AJ, then he blames Clem for any violence that AJ commits to defend himself from Lily and from James. This behavior again evokes the attitudes that normalize the state's separation of black, brown, and working class families, painting Clem as an unfit mother, and James, who hasn't even been around people for years, who is literally characterizing AJ as a bloodthirsty monster, as a superior potential parent. But it also shows that non-violence under neoliberal premises is often another kind of violence in disguise. I mean, even regarding the walkers, James' philosophy runs into the same problems. He thinks they're peaceful compared to humans, but this is fundamentally untrue, as the only way he can prevent them from hurting people is if he traps them in a barn like a cage or a prison, which, that doesn't seem like a great existence either. Violence is never justified to him, but he will villainize those using violence in self-defense more than those who create the violent conditions that necessitate that self-defense. In Season 2, Clementine was simultaneously marginalized as a child and adultified by the group, who used her but never listened to her or paid attention to her needs. Here, she is an equal amongst her peers, who she can influence, but who can also resist her or express agency against her to some degree. Certainly at the start, this group has some amount of power over Clem and AJ by the mere fact that they have resources that the two of them need. But other than what they later accept as a mistake of kicking Clem and AJ out in episode 2, they never wield this power to exploit the two of them. The game's more or less singular ending, with variations about the fate of Violet, Lewis, and Ten based on player input, means that no matter how the player influences Clem, even if these kids don't always like or agree with what she says or does, they're her family now. None of them by blood, all of them by choice. This theme of found family, which the devs talk about in their commentary on the final season, is definitely a theme throughout the whole series, which reaches its final synthesis here. Even A New Frontier, a season which follows Javi and his family, twists the nuclear family around, with an emphasis on collectivist cultures like the Cuban background of the Garcias, where extended family and friends are part of the structure. David, a violent, failed patriarch like Kenny before him, is contrasted with the roughly stitched together family unit of Javi, Kate, Gabe, and Mariana. Kate isn't related to any of them by blood, and Javi is Gabe and Mariana's uncle, not father, but in the end, Javi and Kate are the parents that really mattered. Lee isn't Clem's biological father, but in this world, he's the family that means the most to her, and taking care of Clem becomes his reason for living. Clementine struggles to find a family in season 2, but then she finds AJ, who becomes her reason for going on as well. Nevertheless, like Lee before her, she struggles to raise AJ alone and turns to the New Frontier for help. When that plan goes bust, she eventually finds herself at Texas 2, where she finally finds the people who will love her back, who will take care of her and AJ as much as she takes care of them, a place she can call home. Last but not least, and I know this video is coming up on 3 hours now, to synthesize the political themes of Telltale's The Walking Dead, what do we make of this series' treatment of zombies? I talked a whole bunch in my intro about how zombies are a specific sort of every monster that represent the oppressed masses, racialized, disabled, working classes. And that's super relevant to the previous section where I talked about gated communities and keeping out undesirables when we think about these images of masses of zombies pressing up against walls. Zombies are not fundamentally evil, but pitiful creatures, and yet in most video games we're expected to massacre them without guilt and for fun. Tim Gauthier argues that the boundaries of us and them are actually collapsed in the Walking Dead universe because everyone is infected, and everyone will become a zombie regardless of how they die, meaning the text asks us to rethink the manner in which others, including the infected, are excluded, and on what grounds. This theme is given more emotional depth in the Telltale series, which instead of repeating the line, "We are the Walking Dead," offers narrative moments and player choices that allow us the opportunity to question our objectification and denigration of walkers. This is relevant in the first 3 seasons in the specific instances where someone the characters know and love becomes a zombie. For example, when Lee is forced to kill his zombified brother, who mirrors him in a dark foreshadowing of what he will become. When Kenny has to kill his zombified son, when Clementine herself is faced with a decaying Lee who she must either kill or abandon to unlife. Clementine raises a few particularly interesting questions about the nature of walkers in a few non-player influenced cutscenes or voice lines in the first 2 seasons. For example, she only asks Lee to protect her from the dangerous ones, not to kill all walkers.
There was that thing in the bathroom. It tried to get me.
I know.
But you stopped it.
Yeah, I did.
Can you do that more?
Well, I'm not gonna go looking for them.
I mean, get the dangerous ones.
When Lee tells her that walkers are just like dumb animals, she challenges him.
The dead people saw us come back here? Are they going to find us?
Try not to worry. Even if they saw us, they can't get in here.
We did. Why can't they?
We're a lot smarter than they are. They're just like dumb animals. They can't open doors.
Wow.
He used to have a pet hamster. One night, he figured out how to open the door to his cage. And when we woke up, he'd eaten half a box of cookies.
I don't think this is quite the same.
No, but she has a point.
Right. This time we're the cookies.
And in season 2, she often finds herself wondering who the walkers were and how they died, expressing sorrow and regret for having to hurt them.
That looks like it hurt. Hey, it's okay, boy. Shh. He can't hurt us. Think he had himself tied up? Or did someone force him to do this? Poor guy. I like to think that if they were alive, they'd probably want to help you.
In A New Frontier, the patriarch of the Garcia family is the first zombie they ever see, and Javi and David's mother lovingly caresses his zombified face, disturbing the us-them divide with displays of love and compassion. To echo my earlier question, do we only respect zombies if they're familiar, innocent, and harmless? Or do we do it even if they are unfamiliar, even if they might hurt us, drawing only the necessary line at the need for self-defense? The final season most overtly interrogates the question of the zombie's soul, and not just on the basis of their familiarity, of there being a loved one that's been lost. The point of view that the zombies, not as humans but as something else, deserve respect is raised by James, who refuses to kill walkers or humans and asks that you see walkers as creatures deserving of dignity like any other. I know hearing this after hearing how he treated AJ probably colors this section a bit, but it's worth saying the bastard had some points before he went full racist mode. You get this absolutely beautiful, haunting scene where you see some kind of life inside the walkers, through those old windows, the eyes. The final season's first difficult choice is whether to honor the request of a walker couple who took their own lives and asked to be left alone, or to kill them to get their keys. AJ says they're not people, but Clem says that at least they used to be people and they expressed a wish as people. If the walker's unlife is some kind of afterlife, is it heaven, hell, or purgatory? Is there a reason why burial is so often seen as a mark of respect but not cremation? A reason why everyone's grave is marked by a cross? These hinted religious and spiritual themes are really fascinating to me, something I wish there was more scope to explore, when the figure of the zombie is really all about our fear of death as well, our uncertainty about what happens after death, how we cope with loss, grief, and the deaths of our loved ones. For the most part, these questions have few answers, though if you kill the walker couple, Clem apologizes to them before she does it.
I'm sorry.
This is sort of a broader theme explored throughout the series, but particularly in this season, through a trifecta of humans, walkers, and animals, and the similarities between them. This is quite fascinating in the way that it might unsettle anthropocentrism, the attitude of centering humans or assuming human supremacy over other creatures, but also in a way it crosses boundaries and creates connections and kinship between three disparate groups. An oft-repeated theme in Telltale's The Walking Dead is that sometimes people get angry when they're sad, and sometimes when they're scared, they lash out. This comes up with Kenny and Lily in earlier seasons, particularly in the Season 2 finale where Clem asks Lee, in a memory or in a dream, why Lily killed Carly.
Why did Lily do that to Carly?
I don't know. She was sad, Clem. That can make people angry sometimes.
With this moment staging your final decision, whether or not to kill Kenny, scared and angry, or let Jane, also scared and angry, die. In the final season, Violet says to Clem that the other kids voted to kick her and AJ out, though it was wrong because they were scared and needed someone to blame. The question becomes, if you can empathize with both Kenny and Jane's behavior with these kids, where do you draw the line? The line is, of course, that understanding isn't excusing, and behaviors exist within material contexts, like I discussed before. These themes are mimicked or paralleled in animals. The dog in Season 2 only bites Clem because it's scared and hungry, and Clem, of course, only retaliates to defend herself, showing empathy and apologizing before killing the dog, if that's what you choose as the player, the way she sometimes does with walkers.
I'm sorry.
In the final season, Marlon tells us that his initially threatening dog, Rosie, just needs to get to know Clem and AJ to trust them. Rosie is part of the family. She used to be the headmaster's dog, and like the kids, she was abandoned and discarded by him. Similarly, Brody tells us in her final moments that when Marlon gets scared, he gets angry.
He's scared. And when he's scared, he gets angry.
And after Marlon's death, we decide whether or not to think of him as a monster, or just as a scared kid who made some pretty grave mistakes, but deserves some of our empathy. These moments might hopefully cause us to reflect on our own treatment of other characters, but like walkers, we can't ask animals what they feel or think. We can only assume. Do walkers get scared? Is that why they attack us? Do they deserve our empathy even when they hurt or try to hurt us? Are we really all that different from walkers and animals? And is it a bad thing if we're all kind of the same? Well, perhaps there are limits to this empathy, or how far we can explore it in the game, at least. While it's notable the game only requires us to kill walkers or humans in certain situations, usually self-defense, while making it optional in others, the question of the walker's soul is on shaky ground. If James dies and AJ sees him as a walker, your options are either to agree with him that there is no life after death, or to, as the game puts it, lie.
There's nothing after this.
What?
James isn't in there. He looked right at me, and his eyes were empty. There's nothing after we die.
Why is the game categorically telling me about the nature of the walker's soul after raising all these questions, when we simply don't know what's true? 10, the voice of hope throughout the season, also decides that his drawing of the afterlife is stupid if he survives.
When I saw Minnie's body for real, how the walkers left her, I realized those drawings were stupid. That house will never be real. I'll never meet my sisters again. The only thing real is when we're alive.
And I have no option to tell him what I want to tell him, which is that you can believe in an afterlife and also protect yourself from walkers when they're threatening you. Weirdly, the TV show might have had the only interesting moment on this subject for me, when the token short-lived Muslim character Siddiq, who has a minor role in Telltale's Michonne actually, but he barely speaks and his religion is never mentioned, tells Carl Grimes that his mother believed that human souls are trapped within walker bodies, and to kill them is to set them free. In Fear the Walking Dead, the second season focuses on communities in Mexico which choose not to kill the walkers, instead engaging in spiritual practices to embrace them as part of life. Though the show's writing does go on to insist that death simply cannot be accepted as part of life, it must be banished as well. There is perhaps one nod to religious beliefs about the walkers in the Telltale miniseries Michonne rather than the main series, when Alex says he knows, because of what his grandmother used to tell him, that the walkers are Wendigo, what happens to people who eat other people, implying his grandmother might have been Native American, and offering a spiritual belief about the walkers that could be read metaphorically. We're all infected in the Walking Dead universe, at least all insofar as everyone we meet in the United States is concerned. So is this some kind of curse cast upon us for our cannibalistic behaviors under capitalism?
People are eating each other.
But they weren't before. The banks, the politics, the crap.
The secularism, even atheism of the Western zombie apocalypse genre is a whole other conversation, probably outside of the scope of this already enormous essay, but suffice to say, the modern zombie is an ironic colonization of Haitian religion, which is very seriously held and practiced today. It isn't just superstitious or primitive religion, as the American occupiers considered it. It's a very serious religious practice which deserves respect, and to treat it otherwise is pretty racist. One of the issues that arises here is the question of our wishes as the player about our death. A consistent theme in the Walking Dead universe is that it's better to be dead than a zombie, connected to the disableist rhetoric of euthanasia justification that I mentioned earlier, better to be dead than disabled. But this has a lot of complex dimensions in the narrative universe. In our world, as we've discussed in our video on disability and Life is Strange, euthanasia is not a neutral moral or philosophical issue, but one which exists in the context of a world where euthanasia has been historically used to justify and perpetuate the mass killing of disabled people, rather than advocate for housing, welfare, support, accessibility, and improvements to quality of life and inclusion of disabled people. In the context of the Walking Dead universe, we have to contend with the fact that the zombies are diegetically capable of hurting others. We also have to contend with the fact that they can only express a wish, whether to be left alone or killed, before they become zombies. Afterward, we are making these decisions for them based on an assumption, which never feels right. I talked on stream about how this reminded me of taking the decision to euthanize my cat. First and foremost, I remember wishing that I could ask her what she wanted, but I couldn't, and that left me feeling that any decision I made was going to feel wrong, because it was based on an assumption. Every situation is different and unique, and it's hard to make generalizing statements. I think a lot of this renders the question of euthanasia representation in this universe a lot more difficult, particularly because it is a question of spirituality and belief, about the place of life after death. And all of this makes a lot of sense, right? Because one of the things that zombies are about, which I haven't necessarily talked about loads in this video so far, but has always been haunting us, is death. The finality of death, the inevitability of death, the abject horror of death, its ubiquity, how it's coming for all of us. Not only the fear, but the love and the pity that we feel for the dead, the pain and the grief that we feel for their loss. These themes are perhaps some of the most emotionally compelling in The Walking Dead. Certainly for me, when I played these games for the first time, during the summer I lost my beloved cat, Chickpea. Something I've thought about a lot since she died is how seeing and holding a dead body is something that changes you, especially when it's the body of someone you love. Death finally becomes real, and suddenly the world around you is filled with death. It always was, but now you can see it, like you finally see what's been haunting you. This loss for me also came at a time of spending almost a year, now as you watch this video, more than a year, of grieving for the mass death of Palestinians. When I lost Chickpea, I thought, perhaps if you magnified my grief for her by 1,000,000, and you took away my food and my house, and every day I could feel death's heavy exhale on my shoulder coming for me with the sound of every nearby drone or faraway bomb, maybe then I could understand even a fraction of what Palestinians are going through. I bring this up because earlier I talked about the role reversal at play in the zombie apocalypse genre. Westerners are suddenly plagued by the material hardships that the imperial core wreaks upon people living in the global south. These hardships, of course, include the ubiquity of death, starkly represented by the zombie horde. Our privileged lives in the imperial core make death far away, monstrous, and unreal. Many of us don't have to see death up close till later in life. If we do, maybe it's once or twice, but never 100 or 1,000 times, never day in and day out. We don't know how to talk about death, how to process it, how to feel about it. We're so afraid of it, yet we look away while unleashing it 1,000 times upon those half a world away. Finally, the exploitation of walkers is a recurring theme in the Walking Dead universe, including the Telltale game. It's one thing to kill a walker in self-defense, but is it justified, as James asks, if you don't have to? Further than that, we see several examples of people exploiting the walkers, usually to threaten others or for amusement. From Andrew St. John's chilling talk of watching walkers sizzle and pop on his electric fence, to the chained-up walkers in Roman's camp operating as watchdogs, to the half-alive scarecrows on the walls of Crawford. You've even got Nate and his disturbing sexual fetishization of a lady walker. Thankfully, this doesn't go further than salacious comments, but we know that walkers aren't able to consent to sex, so this adds a nice, disturbing additional element to their zombification. The element of using the walkers for entertainment is perhaps the worst of all, particularly notable in the final season, where if you go hunting with Lewis and Asim, Lewis encourages you to beat a walker like a piñata, just to let off some steam. I can tell him he's wasting time, but I don't have the option to say that I think it's fucked up to have fun beating the shit out of an even half-living creature just because you have power over it. It takes me out of the uniqueness of Telltale's series, throwing me back into the trouble with the zombie genre at large. Killing for fun, telling ourselves it's okay because they can't feel or think. And this particular moment is so uncomfortable because it feels like it's supposed to characterize Lewis as an endearing guy who brings joy to the group, only his idea of fun is beating the shit out of a weak, defenseless creature, and this isn't something the game allows you to challenge. It's a jarring moment in contrast to the other ways that zombiehood is explored in the season. Like, honestly, I just find it really baffling that this is here. While researching for this video, I watched and read a lot of playthroughs and reviews of this game and other zombie games. Earlier, we talked about how Telltale's The Walking Dead subverts zombie games in placing less emphasis on dehumanizing and killing zombies. But there were still a lot of people, mostly men of course, who emphasized and never came to question their love of killing zombies during or after playing this game. They loved characters who were good at killing zombies, referred to others as dead weight or annoying for responding in diverse human ways to trauma. In any case, it's this sort of stark dehumanization and exploitation, and the times that it's encouraged or enjoyed en masse by players, which really cements for me this idea of zombification as a process of denigration and devaluing, of marking life as killable. I guess it comes back to the fact that a text is only politically as challenging as we read it to be. Farka and Ladavese write that video game dystopias, critical dystopias, often place the prospect of hope into the player's hands. The player assumes the role of the dissident and becomes directly responsible for laying the foundations of the better society. In other words, no matter what work the text and the people who make it do, we have work to do as well. Fundamentally, the image of the walkers, like all zombies, may always be riddled with contradiction. The walkers are us, but they are not us. They are how we perceive oppressed people, but they are not oppressed people. They are living, and they are dead. There might be no easy solution, certainly within the universe of The Walking Dead and the specific way it constructs its zombie creatures, where walkers themselves can be mobilized for more subversive narrative purposes. But maybe that's okay as long as we're asking the right questions. The final season repeatedly uses the visual motif of flowers growing out of walkers, or the bodies of walkers half sinking into the earth, an image which invokes Mother Earth's reclamation of herself from capitalism, a theme which is also present in the spin-off series Fear of the Walking Dead, but which also invokes the fundamental inextricability of death and growth. Our deaths are never the end, whether we believe in an afterlife or not. Our bodies return to the earth, the sea, the air, and something new will grow there. And so, as characters like Walter say, the world never ended, but capitalism did, and what grows from its death which isn't complete but requires us all to partake in killing it, new forms of life will grow, hopefully better ones. As Gary Canavan puts it, despite the protestations of biopolitical state racism, despite the endless blaring declarations of national emergencies and states of exception, we don't live in a zombie narrative. We live in the real world, a zombieless world where the only zombies to be found are the ones we ourselves have made out of the excluded, the forgotten, the cast out, and the walled off. In other words, the point of analysing zombie fiction in this way is to be ever alert to how it can infect our way of thinking about the people that zombies represent. I want to believe, and I have to believe, in what 10 in my first playthrough died believing, that someday the age of walkers will end, just like imperialism and colonialism and capitalism will end. More precisely, if each and every one of us does the work to end it, both in our minds and in our communities, and through revolt, rebellion, and revolution. The word apocalypse, I have not been the first to point out, comes from the Greek apokalypsis, meaning a revolution or disclosure. While we now associate the zombie genre with an overwhelming trend of fatalism and misanthropy, the word's etymology reminds us that the ancient and biblical tradition of the apocalypse is necessarily hopeful. In these narratives, the world as it is, its evil, cannibalistic institutions and structures, must be abolished, dismantled, destroyed, if we have any hope of building something totally new and different. As I've argued here at length, the destruction of the world and its capitalist racist institutions should be a revelation. It should bring us the understanding of that past evil and the understanding that we need to build something completely new. The revolution brought by the revolt of the oppressed mass of walkers or zombies is a revolution without aim, but our protagonists can give this revolution its meaning. This means killing the cop in our minds too. So now it's for Clem, AJ, and the rest of the kids at Texas 2 to build their own fully manual, perfectly satisfactory Earth communism. And I have every hope that they will, at least in my save file. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this monster of a video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like, be sure to comment and share your thoughts, and consider subscribing to our channel for more content like this. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do it without you. If you aren't a patron already, please consider giving us long-term support over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT or pinging us a Ko-fi donation. Unfortunately, I don't get paid full-time to make 3-hour video essays, so if you want more, then a little support goes a long way. Catch us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and more for further discussions and conversations, and as always, thank you for watching. Take care.